When the Gjallarhorn's final note echoed across the 9 realms, it marked not just an ending, but the culmination of prophecies written before Odin's grandfather drew breath. The sound that shattered the silence of eternity was both a death knell and a birth cry, announcing that the age of Aesir had ended in blood and fire, exactly as foretold in runes, so ancient that even the Norns themselves had forgotten who first carved them. But here lies the paradox that drove the All-Father to madness. Ragnarok was never just about the twilight of gods. It was about a father and son standing in the ruins of Asgard, one covered in the blood of the god he just killed, the other holding a marble containing the soul of the most powerful being in Norse mythology. What no prophecy revealed was that the ghost of Sparta, destroyer of Olympus, would stand at the center of another pantheon's apocalypse, and this time he would not be alone. The story of Ragnarok cannot be understood without grasping this fundamental truth. Every choice Odin made to prevent his death brought him closer to it. Every giant he slaughtered, every realm he conquered, every son he corrupted, and every prophecy he tried to rewrite only tightened the noose of fate around his neck. The 3 winters of Fimbulwinter that preceded the end were not a warning, but a countdown, triggered by the death of his beloved son Baldur at the hands of a foreign god who had already proven that pantheons could fall. Consider the scale of what transpired. This was not merely the death of gods or the burning of a single realm. When Surt merged with his love Sinmara to become Ragnarok itself, when he drove his flaming blade through Asgard's heart, he was fulfilling a purpose written into the very fabric of existence. The 9 realms connected by Yggdrasil had survived wars, genocides, and countless divine atrocities, but they had never faced the complete obliteration of their ruling pantheon's entire power structure in a single day. Yet as I speak these words, Midgard endures under an eternal winter that may never end. The Lake of Nine sits frozen, its waters that once provided passage between realms now solid ice beneath which the world serpent waits in silence. Where once stood the mighty wall of Asgard, only void remains. The golden halls of Gladshame are ash scattered across non-existence. Valhalla, that eternal battlefield where warriors prepared for the final battle, has transformed into something else entirely, something that even now defies explanation. The irony is breathtaking in its completeness. Odin, who sacrificed his eye for knowledge, who hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to understand the runes, who tortured and killed and manipulated for centuries to prevent Ragnarok, ended up orchestrating every element of his own destruction. His final words, before a dwarf's hammer shattered his soul into oblivion, were not of defiance or rage, but of disbelief. How could the All-Father who saw everything have been so blind? The answer lies in a simple truth that Kratos learned in Greece and carried to Midgard. Prophecies are not chains but guides, and the harder one pulls against them, the deeper they cut. When Baldur knocked on that humble cabin door in the wildwoods, seeking the last guardian of the Jotnar, he found instead a man who had already killed Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and an entire pantheon of gods who thought themselves untouchable. That collision between Greek vengeance and Norse fate would reshape reality itself. But the most chilling aspect of Ragnarok was not its inevitability but its precision. Every death occurred exactly as foretold, yet differently than expected. Thor did die to blood and thunder, but it was Odin's blade through his chest, not Jormungandr's poison. Heimdall did fall to the god of war, but it was a Greek god wielding a spear forged by a dwarf, not Tyr with his sword. Odin did die at Ragnarok, but it was not Fenrir's jaws that ended him, but the combined might of a ghost of Sparta, a Vanir goddess seeking redemption, and a young god torn between 2 natures. What makes this tale worth telling in its entirety is not just the spectacular destruction or the divine battles that shattered mountains and split seas. It is the human story within the godly chaos, a father trying to protect his son from a destiny he does not understand, a mother's plan extending beyond death to save both her family and her people, and a boy discovering that being the champion of the Jotnar means choosing between the family he loves and the purpose he was born to fulfill. Before there were gods to kill or prophecies to fear, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void that existed before existence itself had meaning. In this primordial emptiness, neither time nor space held sway, only potential waiting to be born through violence. To the north lay Niflheim, realm of ice and mist, where 11 rivers of poison flowed from the spring Hruvurgelmir. To the south burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire where Surturd stood eternal guard with his flaming sword, waiting for a purpose that would not manifest for eons. When the frozen rivers of Niflheim met the flames of Muspelheim in the void of Ginnungagap, they created not life but something that preceded it. The ice melted, the vapor rose, and from this cosmic collision emerged Ymir, the first being, the primordial giant, whose body would become the raw material for all creation. Ymir was neither good nor evil, neither wise nor foolish. He simply was, and in his existence lay the template for everything that would follow. As Ymir slept in the void, his body produced the first giants from his sweat and flesh. His left armpit birthed a male and female, while his legs coupled to create a six-headed being. These were not the giants of later stories, noble and wise keepers of prophecy. These were primordial forces of chaos, beings of such fundamental power that their very existence threatened the possibility of order. Yet from the ice that had created Uri came another being, Audhumla, the primordial cow whose milk fed the giant, and whose tongue, licking the salty ice blocks for sustenance, revealed something unprecedented. Over 3 days, Audhumla's tongue exposed first hair, then a head, and finally the complete body of Buri, the first of what would become the Aesir. Buri was beautiful, where Ymir was grotesque, ordered where the giant was chaotic. Buri begat Bor, who looked upon the daughters of the giants, and took one as his wife. From this union came 3 sons, Vili, Ve, and the one who would reshape everything through an act of primordial murder, Odin. The young Odin looked upon Ymir and saw not the father of creation, but an obstacle to it, where others might have seen the being whose body had given birth to giants, and from whose flesh the first gods had emerged. Odin saw only untapped potential locked within a form too chaotic to serve his vision. What happened next would establish the pattern for every divine action that followed. Odin, alone according to his own later telling, though his brothers were likely present, murdered Ymir in the first act of deicide. The death of Ymir was not a battle, but a butchering. His blood flooded from his wounds in such quantities that it drowned almost all of the primordial giants, creating the first genocide in the Norse cosmos. Only Bergelmir and his wife escaped in what some call a wooden box, fleeing to the edges of what would become reality to establish Jotunheim. From Ymir's flesh, Odin crafted Midgard, the middle realm where humans would dwell. From his bones came mountains, from his teeth came rocks, from his hair grew trees, and from his hollowed skull, Odin formed the dome of the sky itself. But Odin's act of creation through murder carried a price that would echo through eternity. In Ymr's blood was prophecy itself, the fundamental truth that what begins in blood must end in blood. As Odin positioned Ymir's brains to become clouds and set sparks from Muspelheim to become stars, he was writing his own doom into the very fabric of reality. The giants who survived would remember. They would carve the truth into walls and stones where Odin's revisions could not reach. The world tree Yggdrasil grew from this act of primal violence, its roots extending through the corpse of Ymir to connect what would become the 9 realms. One root reached to the Well of Urd, where the Norns would take residence, 3 sisters who could see the threads of fate but contrary to what many believe, could not alter them. They were readers, not writers, witnesses to the story that Odin's violence had begun. Another route stretched to Jotunheim, to the well of Mimir where knowledge itself pooled like water. It was at Mimir's well that Odin would make his second defining sacrifice. The well's guardian, Mimir himself, was wisest of beings, and his well contained the accumulated knowledge of all things. Odin approached seeking wisdom to rule his new creation, but Mimir demanded a price that would mark the All-Father forever. Odin plucked out his own right eye and dropped it into the well, where it sank to rest at the bottom, forever watching, forever learning. In return, he received a drink from the well that showed him fragments of what was to come. What Odin saw, in that first glimpse of prophecy, was his own death at Ragnarok, torn apart by a great wolf while flames consumed everything he had built. But rather than accept this fate, Odin began his eternal campaign against prophecy itself. He would hang himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, a spear through his side, sacrificing himself to learn the secrets of the runes. When he finally fell from the tree, he understood the fundamental words of creation, but even this knowledge could not change what he had seen. The creation of the 9 realms followed patterns of separation and control. Asgard for the Aesir, high above all others. Vanaheim for the Vanir, gods of nature and wisdom, who would later war with and ultimately merge with the Aesir. Alfheim for the light elves, though it would become a battlefield. Svartalfheim for the dwarves, master craftsmen, whose skills Odin would exploit. Alfheim for the dishonored dead, a realm of cold and silence. Muspelheim and Niflheim persisted from before creation, and Jotunheim became the refuge of giants who remembered the truth. At the center of it all was Midgard, where Odin would create humanity from ash and elm trees found on a beach, breathing life into them alongside his brothers. These humans, Ask and Embla, would proliferate under the god's protection, never knowing their world was built from the corpse of a murdered giant. Their sky was his skull, and their seas were his blood. They would worship the Aesir as benevolent creators, unaware that their god's founding act was assassination. The Norns, when they emerged at the Well of Urd, brought with them the full weight of fate. Urd who saw the past, Verdandi who saw the present, and Skuld who saw what must come. They carved the fates of gods and men into the world tree itself, and when Odin approached them seeking to change his destiny, they spoke words that would haunt him forever. They told him that the threads of fate were not chains to be broken, but a tapestry already woven, and his every action to prevent Ragnarok was merely following the pattern to its inevitable conclusion. This was the foundation upon which all that followed would build a cosmos born from murder, held together by a tree that grew from a corpse, ruled by a god who had seen his own death and refused to accept it. Every realm, every god, every creature that would come to exist in the Norse cosmos carried within them the primordial violence of their creation. The giants knew this and carved it into their prophecies. The Vanir sensed it in the natural order. Even the dwarves, deep in their forges, could feel the fundamental instability in the very matter they shaped. But it was Odin who carried the heaviest burden of this knowledge. He had killed creation itself to remake it in his image, and in doing so, had ensured that someone would eventually do the same to him. The prophecy of Ragnarok was not a curse placed upon him, but the universe's own immune response to his primordial crime. Every giant he would slaughter in the coming ages, every scheme he would concoct to prevent his fate, every son he would corrupt, and every realm he would subjugate, all of it was just Ymir's blood calling out for balance. And so the stage was set for the long tragedy to come. The 9 realms spun around Yggdrasil, each following their courses, while at the center of it all sat Odin on his throne in Asgard, his ravens flying out each day to bring him news, his remaining eye seeing all that transpired in the present, while the eye in Mimir's well watched from the depths of wisdom itself. He knew Ragnarok would come. He had seen the wolf, the flames, the ending of everything. What he could never see, what no prophecy revealed, was that his death would come not from the prophesied wolf Fenrir, but from a different kind of beast entirely, a ghost of Sparta who had already proven that fate could be defied, prophecies could be broken, and pantheons could fall. The blood of Ymir had foretold an ending, but it had not specified whose hands would bring it about. The rise of Odin from ambitious god to all-father was neither swift nor merciful. In those early days after creation, when the 9 realms still settled into their places around Yggdrasil like bones setting after a break, power was not inherited but taken. The young Odin possessed something his brothers Vili and Ve lacked, a hunger that gnawed at him worse than the ravens that would later serve as his eyes across the realms. He understood that knowledge without power was philosophy, but power without knowledge was mere destruction. He would master both. The Aesir were not yet the unified force of later mythology. They were scattered, tribal, each god claiming dominion over aspects of reality like wolves marking territory. But across the cosmic void, in Vanaheim, another tribe of gods flourished. The Vanir practiced Saedra magic, the art of weaving fate itself, of seeing what would come, and gently guiding it, like a stream diverted by careful placement of stones. Where the Aesir valued strength and conquest, the Vanir treasured wisdom and growth. This fundamental difference would spark the first great war between divine powers. The conflict began, as most wars do, with a misunderstanding that became an insult that became a death. Gullveig was her name, a Vanir goddess who came to Asgard, speaking of Sigurd and its power. The Aesir, threatened by magic they could not comprehend, burned her alive in Odin's hall. 3 times they burned her, and 3 times she rose from the ashes, each resurrection making her more powerful, more terrible. When she finally returned to Vanaheim, she carried with her the seeds of a war that would reshape divine politics forever. The Aesir-Vanir War was not the glorious combat of later conflicts. It was ugly, personal, and seemingly endless. Mountains were ground to dust beneath the feet of warring gods. Entire species were created and destroyed as weapons in a conflict whose original cause both sides had forgotten. Odin led charge after charge against Vanaheim's defenders, his spear Gungnir claiming divine lives. Yet for every Vanir that fell, the earth itself seemed to rise against the invaders. The Vanir's magic turned the very air toxic to Aesir lungs, while Aesir's strength shattered Vanir defenses like glass beneath a hammer. The war ended not with victory, but with exhaustion in exchange. Both tribes recognized that continued conflict would leave the 9 realms defenseless against the giants who watched from Jotunheim with patient eyes. The peace treaty was sealed with an exchange of hostages and marriages. Njord of the Vanir came to live in Asgard with his twin children Freyr and Freya. In return, Hoenir and Mimir went to Vanaheim, though Mimir would later return under circumstances that would define Odin's relationship with knowledge forever. It was through this peace that Odin met Frigg. Though the details of their courtship remained shrouded in mystery, even to those who claimed to know all tales, Frigg was already powerful, already wise, possessing the gift of prophecy, though she spoke of it to none. Their marriage was both political and personal, establishing Odin not just as war chief, but as all-father, patriarch of a new unified pantheon. Frigg would bear him Baldur, the shining god whose beauty and goodness would make him beloved by all, and whose death would ultimately trigger the end of everything. But Odin's appetites extended beyond one queen, beyond one bloodline. He lay with the giantess Njord, Earth herself in divine form, and from this union came Thor, who emerged from the womb already grasping for weapons. His first cry, a thunder crack that shattered mountains. Thor would grow to become everything Odin needed him to be, raw strength without the burden of deep thought, a perfect weapon who questioned nothing as long as there were enemies to fight and mead to drink. The establishment of divine hierarchy required more than children and marriages. Odin needed instruments of control that extended beyond his physical reach. The Valkyries were his solution, warrior maidens chosen from the most fierce fighters who died in battle, returned to serve as psychopomps and executioners. Led by Freya, who had negotiated this role as part of the peace between Aesir and Vanir, they would choose which warriors died in battle and which lived, populating Valhalla with Einherjar, who would fight and die and rise again each day, preparing for Ragnarok. Heimdall's appointment as Watchman of the Bifrost was another calculated move. Born of 9 mothers, themselves sisters and waves of the sea, Heimdall possessed sight that could pierce all veils and hearing that could detect grass growing in distant realms. Odin positioned him at the Rainbow Bridge, not just as guardian, but as surveillance, an all-seeing eye that reported directly to the throne. Heimdall's loyalty was absolute, his devotion to Odin's vision unwavering, qualities that would eventually transform him from protector to enforcer. During this period of consolidation, Tyr emerged as perhaps the most noble of the Aesir. Unlike his fellow gods who reveled in their power over mortals, Tyr sought balance between strength and justice. He would travel between pantheons, learning their ways of war and peace, establishing himself as a mediator who could speak truths even Odin would hear. His temple at the Lake of Nine became a nexus of realm travel, its towers reaching into each of the 9 realms, allowing passage for those who knew the proper keys and combinations. The binding of Fenrir marked the moment when Odin's paranoia transformed from caution to cruelty. The wolf was Loki's son, growing larger each day, and the prophecies spoke clearly that he would devour Odin at Ragnarok. The gods tried twice to bind him with chains, presenting it as a game to the young wolf, who broke them easily, proud of his strength. The third binding was different. Gleipnir, it was called, forged by dwarves from impossible things like the sound of a cat's footfall and the roots of a mountain. When Fenrir grew suspicious, only Tyr was brave enough to place his hand in the wolf's mouth as assurance of good faith. When Gleipnir proved unbreakable, and Fenrir realized he had been trapped, he bit down, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. The god of justice bore his maiming without complaint, but something changed in him that day. He had sacrificed his hand for Odin's fear, had participated in punishing a child for crimes not yet committed. Some say this was when Tyr began his long, slow drift away from Asgard's politics, when he started spending more time in other realms, among other pantheons, seeking a justice that Odin's rule could no longer provide. Odin's relationship with Mimir exemplified his approach to knowledge and power. When Mimir returned from Vanaheim, his head separated from his body by Vanir, who felt betrayed by the hostage exchange. Odin saw opportunity rather than tragedy. He preserved the head with herbs and magic, reanimating it to serve as his personal counselor. Mimir's well of knowledge was one thing, but having the wisest being in the 9 realms bound to serve him, unable to leave, unable to refuse, that was power of a different magnitude. The creation of Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, extended his consciousness across all realms simultaneously. Each morning, they would fly out, witnessing everything that transpired, returning each evening to whisper their observations in his ears. But even Odin feared their flights, expressing concern that thought might not return, but even more so that memory might abandon him. This fear revealed a deep truth about the All-Father, that he understood his actions required both careful planning and selective forgetting. As Asgard solidified its power, the other realms fell into their ordained roles. Alfheim became a battlefield between light and dark elves, their conflict ensuring neither side could threaten Aesir dominance. Svartalfheim's dwarves were bound by contracts and threats to forge weapons and artifacts for the gods, their masterwork creations, like Mjolnir for Thor and Gungnir for Odin, becoming symbols of divine authority. Helheim grew cold and distant under Hel's rule, another of Loki's children, relegated to managing the dishonored dead. The corruption began subtly, as corruption always does. Odin's search for knowledge became obsession. His protection of the realms became domination. The giants, who remembered the truth of creation, became enemies to be eliminated rather than neighbors to be engaged. Every prophecy that spoke of Ragnarok was either destroyed or hoarded, hidden away in Odin's personal collection where he could study them in private, searching for loopholes in fate itself. Thor's birth and maturation into the god of thunder represented both Odin's greatest success and most telling failure. Here was a son of immense power, capable of feats that shook the foundations of reality itself. His hammer Mjolnir could level mountains. His strength could challenge any force in the 9 realms. Yet Odin had shaped him into a blunt instrument, discouraged his questions, rewarded his violence, and punished his doubts. Thor became what Odin needed, an enforcer whose reputation alone could quell rebellion, whose presence at his father's side made even the bold think twice. Baldur's emergence as the beloved god presented a different kind of power. Where Thor was feared, Baldur was adored. His beauty was such that all things loved him. His wisdom gentle, where Odin's was sharp. His strength used to protect rather than punish. Odin saw in Baldur what he himself could never be, a god loved rather than feared, respected rather than obeyed. This golden sun became both pride and pain to the All-Father, a reminder of roads not taken and choices that had led to a throne built on bones. The establishment of Valhalla as both reward and recruitment center demonstrated Odin's strategic genius. Warriors who died gloriously in battle were not simply honored, but conscripted into an eternal army. They would fight each other all day, dying horrible deaths, only to rise at evening to feast and drink, their wounds healed, their memories of pain fading like morning mist. They believed they were chosen, special, blessed. They never questioned why Odin needed an army of the dead, what war he was preparing for that required such numbers. The Valkyries under Freya's command became instruments of a darker purpose. Initially noble choosers of the slain, they gradually transformed into architects of death, ensuring certain warriors fell so they could be recruited, extending conflicts to maximize the harvest of souls. Freya watched this corruption with growing horror, her protests to Odin falling on increasingly deaf ears. She had accepted leadership of the Valkyries as part of the peace between Aesir and Vanir, but she had not agreed to become a merchant of death. As the golden age of Asgard reached its peak, the seeds of its destruction were already sprouting. Every giant Odin ordered killed created orphans who remembered. Every prophecy he tried to prevent through force made its fulfillment more certain. Every son he shaped into a weapon would eventually turn that weaponry against him. The All-Father sat on his throne, his ravens whispering secrets, his wolves at his feet, his spear at his side, believing he had created an eternal order. But in Jotunheim, the giants carved prophecies into stone, where Odin's revision could not reach. In Vanaheim, Freya grew restless under Odin's increasingly tyrannical rule. In Midgard, humans began to question why their prayers brought suffering as often as salvation. And somewhere, in a realm not yet relevant to this tale, a Spartan warrior was making his way north, carrying with him the ashes of a pantheon that had thought itself eternal. The systematic extinction of the giants was not a single event, but a campaign that spanned centuries, each death methodically planned, each murder justified by Odin as necessary for the protection of the realms. But those who witnessed it knew better. This was not protection but paranoia given form, not justice but genocide. Wearing the mask of divine duty, the giants' crime was not what they had done but what they knew. The truth of creation carved into their very bones, stories that contradicted the narrative Odin had woven for his subjects. The campaign began with Bergelmir's descendants, the giants, who had escaped Ymir's drowning blood, and established Jotunheim as their refuge. These were not the mindless monsters of Odin's propaganda, but scholars and prophets, keepers of knowledge that predated the Aesir's rise. Their magic was older, deeper, drawn from the primordial forces that existed before Odin shaped the world from murder. They could read fate in ways that even the Norns respected, and this above all else made them dangerous to a god whose entire rule was built on defying prophecy. Thor became his father's perfect instrument in this bloody work. Each journey to Jotunheim was presented as a glorious adventure, each giant killed as a victory for order over chaos. The thunder god would return to Asgard covered in blood, dragging massive corpses as trophies, while the skalds composed songs about his heroism. But those who looked closely could see the truth in the bodies he brought back. Elderly giants clutching scrolls, female giants shielding their children, young giants who had barely learned to speak their ancestors' names before Thor's hammer silenced them forever. The death of Tymur, last of the stone giants, exemplified the brutal efficiency of Odin's genocide. Tymur was ancient even by giant standards, his body a living mountain, his breath creating weather patterns, his footsteps carving valleys. He had committed no crime beyond existing, had threatened no realm beyond taking up space, but his death would send a message to all giants that none were beyond the reach of Thor's hammer. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 3 days. Thor struck him down in Midgard, and Tymur's body became a mountain range, his blood a frozen river, his final breath a perpetual wind that would blow for generations. But it was not just Thor who served as executioner. Odin himself would often accompany these raids, though his methods were different. Where Thor brought thunder and hammer, Odin brought cunning and cruelty. He would arrive at giant settlements disguised as a wanderer, accepting their hospitality, learning their secrets, identifying their prophets and lore keepers. Then, in the night, Gungnir would find hearts, and by morning, entire bloodlines of knowledge would be severed. The Jotnar, as they called themselves, began to adapt. They carved their prophecies not just in stone, but in the very fabric of reality, hiding them in patterns of stars, in the growth of trees, in the migration of birds. They created shrines that would only reveal themselves to those of giant blood, preservation chambers that existed partially outside the flow of time. They knew they were dying, knew their race was being systematically eliminated, but they were determined that their truth would survive even if they did not. The corruption of the Valkyries accelerated during this period. Freya watched in growing horror as her noble warriors were used not to choose the honored dead, but to ensure certain battles occurred, certain giants fell, certain prophecies were prevented from manifesting. The Valkyries would appear before battles, not as neutral arbiters but as Odin's spies, marking which giants possessed dangerous knowledge, which children might grow to become prophets, which settlements harbored artifacts that challenged Asgard's version of history. It was during this time that Freya's marriage to Odin began its descent into hatred. She had married him partly for politics, partly for power, but also because she had seen in him a god who could unite the realms under wisdom rather than fear. Instead, she watched him transform into everything she despised. When she protested the giant killings, he dismissed her as weak. When she refused to send Valkyries on assassination missions, he began commanding them directly. When she tried to protect giant children by hiding them in Vanaheim, he accused her of treason. The breaking point came when Odin demanded Freya teach him Saedra the magic, the Vanir art of seeing and shaping fate. She initially agreed, hoping that understanding this power might calm his paranoia, might show him that fate was not an enemy to be fought, but a river to be navigated. Instead, Odin perverted the teachings, using Saedra not to understand fate, but to identify those who might threaten his version of it. He turned prophecy into a weapon, wisdom into surveillance, magic into murder. When Freya finally rebelled, refusing to participate in what she called the systematic erasure of history itself, Odin's response was swift and brutal. He could not kill her, for she was too powerful, and her death would restart the war with the Vanir. Instead, he cursed her with chains more cruel than any physical binding. He cut her Valkyrie wings, the physical manifestation of her ability to travel between realms. Trapping her in Midgard, he bound her to the earth itself, making it impossible for her to leave, even if she found other means of travel. And most cruelly, he left her with her powers intact, forced to watch the continuing genocide through her Sidra visions, but unable to intervene. The disappearance of Tyr marked another crucial moment in this bloody period. The god of justice had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the campaigns against the giants. He had traveled to Jotunheim in peace, had learned their languages, had discovered that their prophecies spoke not of evil, but of balance, not of chaos, but of cycles. When he brought this knowledge to Odin, suggesting that perhaps Ragnarok was not a threat but a natural transition, the All-Father's rage was volcanic. What exactly happened to Tyr remains unclear. Odin claimed he had been killed by giants during a diplomatic mission, a tragedy that justified even harsher reprisals. But whispers spread through the realms that Tyr had not died but fled, or been imprisoned, or worse. Some said Odin had trapped him in a prison between realms, neither alive nor dead. Others claimed Tyr had voluntarily exiled himself, unable to serve a king whose justice had become indistinguishable from tyranny. The truth, as would later be revealed, was both simpler and more complex than any imagined. The creation of the Jotnar shrines was the giants' greatest act of defiance and preservation. Knowing their time was ending, the greatest artists and prophets among them collaborated on massive murals that told the true history of the realms. These were not simple carvings, but multi-layered stories that could only be fully understood by those who possessed giant blood or had been taught their deepest mysteries. They told of Odin's murder of Ymir, of the campaigns of extinction, of prophecies that promised justice would eventually come from an unexpected source. One shrine in particular would prove crucial to everything that followed. It showed a figure marked with red, carrying the ashes of one world into another, accompanied by a child who bore two names. The prophecy spoke of the ghost of Sparta, though that title meant nothing to those who carved it, and of Loki, though the child bearing that name had not yet been born. This shrine was hidden more carefully than any other, protected by magic that would only allow it to be found when the time was right, when the subjects of its prophecy were ready to understand their role. The Berserker curse represented one of Odin's most insidious weapons against the giants. He would capture giant warriors and subject them to horrific magical experiments, transforming them into rage-filled monsters that could barely distinguish friend from foe. These berserkers would be released back into Jotunheim, where they would slaughter their own people in uncontrollable fury. Entire giant settlements would tear themselves apart as the curse spread through bloodlines, turning their greatest strength into their ultimate weakness. The dwarves of Svartalfheim, master craftsmen, who had initially remained neutral in the conflict between Aesir and giants, were forced to choose a side through economic and physical coercion. Odin demanded they forge weapons specifically designed to kill giants, threatening to collapse their realm's economy if they refused. Chains that could bind giant magic, spears that could pierce giant hide, artifacts that could track giant blood across any distance. The dwarves complied, though many did so with heavy hearts, knowing they were contributing to extinction. During this period, strange reports began filtering in from the edges of Midgard. Travelers spoke of a foreign warrior, pale-skinned and marked with red, who had appeared in the northern forests. He carried weapons unlike any seen in the Nine Realms, chains that burned with the fury of another pantheon's hell, an axe that carried the chill of primordial ice. He sought no contact with the Aesir, wanted no part in their wars, desired only solitude. Odin's ravens watched him, but could not penetrate the ward of privacy that seemed to surround him, a protection that puzzled even the All-Father. This warrior was Kratos, though that name was not yet known in the Norse lands. He had arrived carrying the ashes of Olympus on his skin and the weight of a pantheon's death in his heart. He had chosen this distant land precisely because it seemed untouched by the politics of gods, unaware that he had arrived in the middle of a genocide that would make his own crimes seem almost merciful by comparison. He met a woman in those woods. Faye they called her, though she bore another name known only to giants. Faye was the last guardian of the Jotnar, though none knew this title belonged to her. She had hidden in plain sight for decades, using magic to mask her giant heritage, living as a mortal woman in the forests of Midgard. She had watched her people die one by one, had felt each death through the connection all giants shared, had carved her own prophecies in hidden places where Odin's eyes could not reach. When she met Kratos, she recognized him not just from prophecy, but from the weight he carried, the unmistakable burden of one who had killed gods. Their courtship was slow, careful, built on mutual recognition of pain and shared understanding of loss. She did not tell him what she was, and he did not tell her what he had done, but both knew the other carried secrets worth worlds. When they finally came together, it was not just love but conspiracy, not just passion but planning. She knew what their child would be, had seen it in visions that came clearer with each passing day. Kratos knew only that he had found peace for the first time since his hands had been stained with divine blood. As Faye and Kratos built their hidden life in Midgard, the slaughter of giants reached its crescendo. Entire realms within Jotunheim were emptied, their populations reduced to scattered bones and abandoned prophecies. Thor's hammer struck down the last of the mountain giants. The final frost giants fell to Odin's spear, and the prophetic giants who could speak with the voices of the future were silenced one by one. The 9 realms grew quieter, emptier, less magical with each death. But in that silence, something else was growing. The world tree itself seemed to recoil from the violence, its branches drawing back from Asgard, as if repelled by the blood that soaked its roots. The Norns spoke less and less, their pronouncements becoming cryptic to the point of uselessness. The natural order that had maintained balance between realms began to fracture, creating gaps and inconsistencies that even Heimdall's all-seeing gaze could not penetrate. The final organized resistance of the giants came not through warfare, but through sacrifice. The remaining prophets gathered in secret and performed a ritual that would ensure their ultimate victory, even in death. They bound their prophecies to the world tree itself, made them part of the fundamental structure of reality. No matter how many giants Odin killed, no matter how thoroughly he erased their physical presence, their truth would remain, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst, the right combination of factors to manifest. That catalyst was already walking the forests of Midgard, teaching a young boy to hunt, to fight, to survive in a world where gods were not saviors but threats. Atreus did not yet know his name was Loki, did not understand that his mother was the last of a murdered race, did not realize his father had already destroyed one pantheon. He knew only that his parents loved him with a fierce protection that suggested the world held dangers he could not yet imagine. The age of divine bloodshed was ending not because Odin had achieved victory, but because he had run out of giants to kill. Jotunheim stood empty except for wind and prophecy, its great halls echoing with absence. The few giants who survived did so by hiding so deeply that even they forgot what they were, their heritage buried beneath layers of protective magic. The All-Father sat on his throne, believing he had won, that he had prevented Ragnarok by eliminating those who prophesied it. He could not have been more wrong. Every giant killed had been a thread in the tapestry of fate, and by cutting them, Odin had not unraveled the pattern, but completed it. The prophecies spoke of Ragnarok, not as something the giants would cause, but as something their absence would ensure. The blood of Ymir had demanded balance from the moment Odin spilled it, and that balance would come not from the giants' vengeance, but from their vindication. Asgard at its zenith was a realm that defied mortal comprehension, a city of gold and light suspended above all creation, where the very air hummed with divine power, and every stone was carved from crystallized prayer. The great wall that surrounded it, built by a giant mason whom Thor had murdered rather than pay, gleamed with such brilliance that it could be seen from every realm when the light struck it at dawn. Within those walls, the Aesir had constructed a paradise that was simultaneously a fortress, a palace, and a weapon aimed at the throat of anyone who would challenge their supremacy. The heart of this golden age was Gladsheim, Odin's hall, where the high throne Hildskjalf allowed him to observe every corner of the 9 realms. From this seat, enhanced by magic older than memory, no secret could hide from his gaze except those protected by powers equal to his own. The throne room's pillars were carved from the bones of ancient beings whose names had been deliberately forgotten, each one inscribed with runes that reinforced Odin's dominion over fate itself. Here the All-Father would sit for days without moving, his consciousness scattered across reality like seeds on the wind, gathering information that he hoarded more jealously than any dragon hoarded gold. Valhalla stood as the crown jewel of Asgard's military might, a hall so vast that its roof seemed to be the sky itself, its rafters lost in clouds that rained mead instead of water. 540 doors opened into this warrior's paradise, each wide enough for 800 Einherjar to march through shoulder to shoulder. Every morning, these chosen dead would wake fully healed from whatever wounds had killed them the day before, take up their weapons, and march out to the great plain of Idaval to battle each other in preparation for Ragnarok. The combat was real, the deaths genuine, the pain absolute. Warriors would be cleaved in half, decapitated, impaled, burned alive, frozen solid, and torn apart in ways that would make even gods flinch. Yet as the sun set, a horn would sound, and all the scattered pieces of flesh would flow back together like water finding its level. The Einherjar would rise, laugh about their deaths as if they were jokes shared between friends, and march back into Valhalla for the nightly feast where they would eat the boar sayer Ymir, who was slaughtered each evening and reborn each dawn, and drink mead that flowed from the udder of the goat Hydrun. This eternal cycle served multiple purposes for Odin. It created an inexhaustible army that grew larger with every battle fought in Midgard. It removed the greatest warriors from the mortal realm, preventing them from becoming threats to divine rule. Most importantly, it normalized violence and death to such a degree that the Einherjar lost all fear, all hesitation, all humanity, becoming perfect weapons pointed wherever Odin directed them. Thor, during this period, reached the apex of his power and reputation. His palace Bilskirnir was the largest structure in Asgard, with 640 rooms, each one a monument to a different victory. The Thunder God would return from his campaigns against the giants, dragging corpses that would be displayed like trophies before being thrown from the edge of Asgard to crash into the realms below. His wife Sif, whose golden hair had been cut by Loki and replaced with living gold spun by dwarven craftsmen, presided over feasts where Thor would drink enough mead to drown a mortal city and tell stories of slaughter that grew more elaborate with each telling. Yet beneath the boasting and celebration, those who knew Thor well could see cracks forming. His drinking, always prodigious, had become desperate, as if he was trying to drown something that wouldn't stay submerged. His sons Modi and Magni competed viciously for his attention, each trying to prove themselves worthy through acts of increasing brutality. When Thor looked at them, observers noted, his eyes would sometimes go distant, as if he was seeing not his children, but reflections of something he was trying not to recognize in himself. Baldur represented everything. Thor was not. The golden sun, whose mere presence brought joy to all who encountered him. His beauty was such that flowers turned to follow him like he was the sun, and his wisdom was sought by gods and mortals alike. Unlike his brothers who reveled in combat, Baldur sought to preserve and protect, to build rather than destroy. His hall Breidablik was designed so that nothing impure could enter, a sanctuary where even the most tormented soul could find peace. The relationship between Baldur and his mother Frigg was the stuff of legend even among gods. She loved him with an intensity that bordered on obsession, seeing in him all the goodness that the Aesir could represent if they chose wisdom over war. When prophecies began to speak of Baldur's death as the first sign of Ragnarok, Frigg undertook a quest that revealed both her power and her desperation. She traveled to every corner of creation, extracting oaths from all things that they would never harm her son. Fire swore not to burn him, water not to drown him, metal not to pierce him, stone not to crush him. Only mistletoe, young and seemingly harmless, was overlooked in her quest. This single oversight would prove to be the fulcrum on which the fate of all 9 realms would turn. Though none could foresee it during the Golden Age, when Baldur seemed invincible, the gods would make a game of throwing weapons at him, laughing as swords bounced off his skin, arrows turned aside before reaching him, and even Thor's hammer Mjolnir could not leave a bruise. The light and dark elves of Alfheim waged their eternal war during this period, a conflict that had raged so long its original cause was lost to history. The light elves controlled the realm's temple, which housed the light of Alfheim, a power source that could illuminate or blind entire realms. The dark elves, driven underground, fought to reclaim what they insisted was originally theirs. Odin encouraged this conflict, understanding that a unified Alfheim might pose a threat to Asgard's dominance, while an eternally divided one served as both a distraction and a source of military technology that the Aesir could appropriate. In Svartalfheim, the dwarven brothers Brucker and Eitri had become the 9 realms' premier weaponsmiths, their forge producing artifacts of such power that even gods feared what might emerge from their flames. They had created Mjolnir for Thor, a hammer that never missed its target and always returned to his hand. They had forged Gungnir for Odin, a spear that never failed to kill what it was thrown at. They crafted Gullinbursti, a golden boar that could run faster than any horse through air and water, and Draupnir, a golden ring that produced 8 identical rings every 9th night, ensuring Odin's wealth was literally infinite. Yet the dwarves worked under duress, their realm held hostage by Asgard's military might. Every masterwork they created for the gods was a chain that bound them tighter to servitude. They carved their resentment into their creations in ways too subtle for even Odin to detect, weaknesses that would only manifest at crucial moments, flaws that were features waiting for the right circumstances to activate. The collection of knowledge in Odin's personal vault had grown to proportions that defied physical space. He had stolen prophecies from every corner of creation, accumulated artifacts from pantheons that no longer existed, preserved the heads of seers who could speak of futures that might have been. The mask, broken into fragments and scattered across realms, occupied a special place in his obsession. This artifact, older than the 9 realms themselves, supposedly contained the answer to the question that drove Odin's every action. What was the truth behind everything, the fundamental nature of reality that even gods were subject to? His search for these mask fragments had led him to commit acts that even other Aesir found troubling. He had tortured beings whose only crime was knowing where a piece might be hidden. He had destroyed entire libraries because they contained references to the mask that he wanted no one else to read. He had created tears in reality itself, rifts between realms that leaked strange energies, and occasionally disgorged creatures that should not exist, all in pursuit of understanding that always seemed just beyond his grasp. The corruption beneath Asgard's golden surface was visible only to those who looked closely. The Valkyries, once noble choosers of the slain, had become automated extensions of Odin's will. Their leader Sigrun, struggled to maintain their original purpose, while her sisters descended into madness, their minds shattered by the contradiction between their noble calling and the brutal reality of their service. Each Valkyrie had been bound to physical form through Odin's magic, trapped in armor that was both protection and prison, unable to remove it, unable to die, unable to escape the endless cycle of choosing the slain for a war that grew more senseless with each passing year. Freya, trapped in Midgard by Odin's curse, had become a legend among mortals who knew her only as the Witch of the Woods. She had constructed a home between realms, a pocket of space where Odin's eyes could not fully penetrate, though she remained bound to Midgard's soil. Her curse was particularly cruel because it left her with all her powers except the ones that mattered most. She could heal any wound except her own broken heart, could see all futures except her own freedom, could practice the most powerful Sidra magic except the spell that would break her chains. The humans of Midgard prospered under Asgard's protection, though prosperity came at a price they were only beginning to understand. Every tribe was required to send their greatest warriors to die gloriously in battle, ensuring a steady stream of Einherjar for Valhalla. Temples to Odin dominated every major settlement, their priests teaching that suffering in life was merely preparation for glory in death. The old ways, the traditions that predated Aesir dominance, were being systematically erased, replaced with a mythology that painted Odin as the benevolent All-Father who had saved humanity from the chaos of giants. But in hidden places, some humans preserved different stories. They spoke in whispers of a time before the Aesir, when giants walked among them as teachers and protectors, when magic was not the exclusive domain of gods, but something all beings could access. These stories were dangerous to possess, deadly to share, but they persisted like seeds buried deep in frozen ground, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. During this golden age, strange reports continued to filter in from the edges of the 9 realms. The Greek Pantheon had fallen, Olympus was ash, and the god responsible had vanished. Some said he had died in the destruction he caused, others that he wandered the world seeking redemption that could never come. Odin's ravens brought him fragments of information about this ghost of Sparta, but something about the tale troubled the All-Father in ways he could not articulate. A mortal who had become a god, who had then killed the very pantheon that elevated him. It was a story that challenged everything Odin believed about divine permanence. In secret, Odin began preparing for the possibility that this god-killer might come to the Norselands. He reinforced Asgard's defenses with magic specifically designed to repel foreign divine powers. He instructed Heimdall to watch for any sign of Greek divine essence entering the 9 realms. He even sent discreet envoys to the ruins of Olympus, trying to understand how a pantheon that had existed since the dawn of time could simply cease to be. The envoys never returned. The prosperity of Asgard had created a generation of younger gods who had never known true adversity. They had been born after the war with the Vanir, after the binding of Fenrir, after the giants had been reduced to scattered survivors. Gods like Vidar and Vali, Hadr and Hermod, possessed divine power but lacked the harsh wisdom that came from genuine struggle. They believed the stories of Ragnarok were merely tales to frighten children, that Odin's preparations were the paranoid obsessions of an old god who had outlived his wars. This complacency extended to the management of the 9 realms. The Aesir had become administrators rather than warriors, more concerned with maintaining the status quo than preparing for threats. They held elaborate ceremonies and competitions, celebrating victories from centuries past, while ignoring signs that the foundations of their power were eroding. The world tree itself had begun showing signs of disease, its leaves occasionally falling black and withered, but the gods dismissed this as natural cycles rather than symptoms of deeper rot. Loki, during this period, occupied a unique position in Asgard's hierarchy. Not fully Aesir, not entirely trusted, yet too useful to discard. He served as Odin's problem solver for situations that required cunning rather than strength. His shape-shifting abilities allowed him to infiltrate places even Odin's ravens could not reach. His silver tongue could convince enemies to become allies, or allies to destroy each other. Yet every task he completed for Odin came with a price, usually paid by someone else, and the accumulation of these prices would eventually demand its own accounting. The relationship between Loki and Thor was particularly complex during the Golden Age. They would go on adventures together, Loki's cunning complementing Thor's strength, but there was always an undercurrent of resentment. Thor received glory for victories that Loki's intelligence had made possible. Loki was blamed for failures that Thor's impulsiveness had caused. This dynamic, repeated over centuries, created a poisonous codependency that would have consequences neither could foresee. The construction of Tyr's temple at the Lake of Nine represented the height of inter-realm cooperation, a massive structure that served as a hub for travel between all 9 realms. Its design incorporated architectural elements from every realm, its mechanisms powered by a combination of dwarven engineering, light elf magic, and Vanir cider. Tyr himself oversaw its construction, ensuring that no single realm could control access to the others, that travel would remain free for all who sought it peacefully. This philosophy put Tyr increasingly at odds with Odin, who saw the temple as a security risk, a way for enemies to move freely between realms without Asgard's knowledge or permission. The arguments between them grew heated, with Tyr insisting that isolation bred ignorance and fear, while Odin maintained that openness invited invasion and corruption. The fact that Tyr had traveled to other pantheons and returned with ideas about justice and governance that challenged Aesir supremacy only deepened Odin's suspicion. The prosperity of the Golden Age had also created an economy of divine favor that corrupted the natural order. Mortals no longer worked to improve their lives, but instead sought the attention of gods through increasingly elaborate sacrifices. Agriculture withered as farmers became warriors seeking glorious death. Craftsmanship declined as smiths focused on weapons rather than tools. Families were torn apart as fathers and sons competed to die in ways that would catch a Valkyrie's attention. In the depths of Helheim, Hel, another of Loki's children, condemned for the crime of her birth, presided over the dishonored dead with a bitter understanding of divine justice. Half living, half corpse, she embodied the binary nature of existence that the Aesir refused to acknowledge. Her realm grew larger each year, filled with those who died of sickness, old age, or simple accident. Those whose deaths were not deemed glorious enough for Valhalla. She prepared them for a different kind of war, though what that war might be, even she did not fully understand. The Golden Age of Asgard was, in its final analysis, a facade of light built over a foundation of shadows. Every achievement was tainted by the methods used to accomplish it. Every victory carried the seeds of future defeat. Every moment of divine glory was purchased with mortal suffering. The gods sat in their golden halls, drinking mead that never ran dry, eating food that regenerated eternally, wielding weapons that never failed, believing themselves eternal and untouchable. But in the forests of Midgard, a boy named Atreus was learning to hunt from a father who spoke little, but whose every movement suggested barely controlled violence. His mother, Faye, was teaching him languages that had no books, showing him patterns in nature that corresponded to no known magic, preparing him for a destiny that existed in no prophecy Odin had ever read. The Golden Age was ending, though no one in Asgard could see it yet. The first crack would come not from external invasion or internal rebellion, but from a simple knock on a wooden door, when a god seeking something he could not feel would find instead something he never expected, a father protecting his son. The ravens Hugin and Munin departed Asgard, each dawn like twin shadows cast by a sun that had not yet risen, their wings cutting through the boundaries between realms as easily as a blade through silk. Thought and memory they were called, though their function had evolved far beyond simple observation. They had become Odin's neural network stretched across existence, each feather a sensor, each caw a data point, in an endless stream of intelligence that flowed directly into the All-Father's consciousness. No conversation in a Midgard mead hall was too trivial, no giant's dying word too quiet, no prayer whispered in darkness too secret for these living extensions of divine paranoia. The transformation of Midgard's religious landscape happened gradually, then suddenly, like ice forming on a lake, until one morning, the entire surface was frozen solid, where once humans had worshipped at stones marked by their ancestors, honoring spirits of land and sea. Now massive temples to the Aesir dominated every horizon. These structures were not built by human hands alone, but raised through divine intervention, their foundations sunk deep into the earth by Thor's hammer, their walls blessed with runes that Odin himself had carved, making them inviolate to any force that might oppose Asgard's will. The priests of these temples were chosen, not for their wisdom or compassion, but for their ability to inspire profitable violence. They taught that every wound received in battle was a prayer, every enemy killed an offering, every death in combat a guaranteed passage to Valhalla's eternal glory. Young men would deliberately seek out conflicts, turning seasonal raids into constant warfare, transforming what had been occasional territorial disputes into an endless harvest of souls for Odin's growing army. Mothers learned to celebrate when their sons died violently, to mourn when they passed peacefully in their beds. In the northern reaches of Midgard, the berserker curse that Odin had originally created as a weapon against the giants had mutated into something even he had not foreseen. Entire bloodlines now carried the taint, passing it from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. These cursed warriors would enter battle rage at the slightest provocation, their strength multiplying tenfold while their minds dissolved into pure animalistic fury. They could not distinguish friend from foe, often slaughtering their own shield brothers in their madness. Yet they were prized by war chiefs because a single berserker could turn the tide of battle, even if the cost was measured in allied blood. The dwarves of Svartalfheim found themselves trapped in an economic servitude more complete than any chain. Every piece of masterwork they created for the Aesir increased Asgard's power, which in turn increased the gods' ability to demand more. The forges ran constantly, their flames fed by materials that Odin's ravens would identify in the deepest mines and most hidden quarries. Dwarven children were born to the sound of hammers on anvils and died to the same rhythm, their entire existence defined by production quotas set by gods who valued their craft but not their lives. The Lake of Nine had become the crossroads of the Nine Realms, its waters touching every shore, simultaneously through magic that predated even Odin's understanding. Tyr's temple at its center was a masterpiece of diplomatic architecture, designed to be neutral ground where all beings could meet as equals. The temple's mechanisms were protected by layers of enchantments that prevented any single realm from claiming dominance over the travel network. Yet even this monument to cooperation had been corrupted by Odin's influence. Hidden within its architecture were recording devices, crystalline structures that captured conversations and stored them for later retrieval by those who knew the proper keys. It was during this period of expanding influence that Tyr made his most controversial decision. Using knowledge gained from his travels to other pantheons, he created the Unity Stone, an artifact that could open passages not just between the Nine Realms, but between different mythologies entirely. He had walked among Egyptian gods, conversed with Celtic deities, even ventured to the Far East, where dragons were not monsters, but symbols of wisdom. Each pantheon he discovered was both isolated and connected, separate verses in a cosmic song that none of them could hear in its entirety. The Unity Stone's existence terrified Odin more than any prophecy of Ragnarok. The idea that there were entire pantheons beyond his knowledge, gods whose power might equal or exceed his own, realities where his carefully constructed order meant nothing. This was an existential threat that no amount of warriors in Valhalla could address. He demanded Tyr surrender the stone, but the god of war refused, arguing that isolation bred stagnation, that the 9 realms needed to learn from other mythologies if they were to evolve beyond endless cycles of violence. The prophecies, speaking of a marked warrior from another land, began appearing with increasing frequency during this time. Giants who had hidden their heritage through powerful magic would risk exposure to carve new warnings in hidden places. The descriptions were always consistent in their core elements, but varied in their interpretations. Some showed him as a destroyer who would bring about Ragnarok through pure rage. Others depicted him as a catalyst who would give the prophecy its true meaning. All agreed on certain details that seemed impossible to reconcile. He would be a god who had killed gods, a father who had lost a child, a monster who sought redemption, a warrior marked by ashes that could never be washed clean. When Kratos finally arrived in Midgard, he came not as a conqueror, but as a refugee, though he would never use that word to describe himself. The destruction of Olympus had left him hollow, purposeless, carrying guilt that had weight and mass and gravitational pull. He had wandered for decades, perhaps centuries. Time held little meaning for one who had killed Kronos himself before reaching the Norse lands. He chose them not because they called to him, but because they were far from Greece, far from reminders, far from the screams that still echoed in his memories. The meeting between Kratos and Faye was no accident, though neither initially realized the full extent of Destiny's hand in their encounter. She had been tracking him since his arrival, this foreign god whose very presence created ripples in the fabric of prophecy. Her giant heritage gave her the ability to see beyond the immediate, to understand implications that even Odin's ravens could not perceive. She approached him not as the last guardian of the Jotnar, but as a warrior woman living alone in the woods, someone who might understand the burden of solitude. Their first conversation lasted 3 words. Their second, 5. By their 10th meeting, they were sharing silences that communicated more than most beings could express in hours of speech. She saw in him a kindred spirit, someone who had lost everything to divine cruelty. He saw in her a strength that did not require violence to prove itself, a wisdom that came from understanding rather than domination. Neither spoke of their true natures, though both suspected the other carried secrets worth worlds. When they became lovers, it was with the careful tenderness of those who had forgotten they could still feel. When they decided to have a child, it was with full knowledge that they were bringing new life into a cosmos hostile to existence itself. Faye knew from her prophetic gifts what their son would become, though she kept this knowledge locked away even from her own conscious thoughts. Kratos knew only that he wanted to be a better father than he had been before, though the ashes of his first child still clung to his skin like accusation made manifest. The birth of Atreus was attended by no midwife, witnessed by no god, recorded in no divine ledger. Faye had woven protections around their forest home that made it invisible to divine sight, unplottable by raven reconnaissance, untouchable by Aesir influence. The boy grew up believing his mother was merely human, his father simply a stern warrior from a distant land. He did not know that his blood carried the legacies of 2 pantheons, that his existence was prophesied in languages no living being could speak, that his very name was a lie designed to protect him from truths that would reshape reality. Faye's long-term planning was meticulous beyond even Odin's paranoia. She carved prophecies not just in stone, but in the growth patterns of trees, the migration routes of birds, the very dreams of those who lived near their forest. Each element was designed to activate at precisely the right moment, creating a cascade of revelations that would guide her son toward his destiny, while preventing anyone, even Odin, from interfering with the crucial moments. She taught Atreus languages that had no written form, showing him how to read the world itself as text, though he thought they were merely games to pass the time. The corruption spreading through the 9 realms was not just political or religious, but fundamental to reality itself. The world tree, which had grown from soil soaked in Ymir's blood, was beginning to remember its violent origins. Its roots, which touched every realm, were carrying that memory like an infection, spreading the truth that Odin had tried to bury beneath layers of mythology and propaganda. In Alfheim, the light began flickering irregularly. In Helheim, the dead were growing restless. In Muspelheim, Surge stood at his post, feeling an anticipation he had not experienced since before creation. The Vanir in their realm watched all of this. With the patience of those who understood natural cycles, they had never fully accepted the peace with the Aesir, maintaining their own culture and magic despite official unification. Freyr and his remaining followers practiced the old ways, the Sidre magic that worked with fate rather than against it. They could feel the approaching storm, not through prophecy, but through the same instinct that tells animals when an earthquake is coming. They began their own preparations, though what they were preparing for, even they could not fully articulate. The discovery of other pantheons, through Tyr's secret travels, had created an underground network of divine refugees and explorers. Gods from fallen or failing mythologies would occasionally appear at the edges of the 9 realms, seeking sanctuary or knowledge, or simply confirmation that their fate was not unique. Each brought stories of their own apocalypses, their own cycles of creation and destruction, their own prophecies that seemed to echo the Norse predictions of Ragnarok. A pattern was emerging that suggested something beyond individual pantheons, a cosmic rhythm that all mythologies danced to whether they knew it or not. During this period, Odin's experimentation with the mask fragments intensified. He had collected 3 of the 8 pieces, each one revealing partial truths that drove him deeper into obsession. The mask showed him glimpses of reality behind reality, the code beneath creation, the fundamental equations that governed existence. But the knowledge came at a cost measured in sanity and stability. Each time he gazed through even a fragment of the mask, small tears would appear in the fabric of the 9 realms, rifts that leaked strange energies, and occasionally allowed things that should not exist to crawl through. The preparations for Ragnarok were happening on every level of existence, from the cosmic to the personal warriors' sharpened blades that would never dull, yet would break at crucial moments. Mothers sang lullabies that were actually prophecies, though they did not know the language they were speaking. Children played games that reenacted battles that had not yet occurred, using rules that would only make sense when the end began. Even the seasons were rehearsing their final performance, with winters growing longer and summers more desperate, as if nature itself was practicing for the 3-year freeze that would herald the end. In his hidden home in the wild woods, Kratos trained his son in combat with an intensity that seemed excessive for a child who faced no immediate threats. Every lesson was layered with meanings within meanings. When he taught Atreus to read his enemies, he was also teaching him to read the world. When he showed him how to survive in the wilderness, he was preparing him for a time when civilization would cease to exist. When he emphasized control over strength, discipline over power, he was trying to save his son from a fate he had seen destroy everything he had once loved. Baldur's curse began as a mother's love and became a god's damnation. When Frigg had extracted oaths from all things that they would never harm her beloved son, she believed she was protecting him from the prophecy of his death that would trigger Ragnarok. Instead, she had created a different kind of death, one that killed him moment by moment while leaving his body intact. The invulnerability she gifted him came with a price that no prophecy had foretold: complete sensory deprivation that transformed existence into an endless, featureless void where even pain would have been a blessing. Imagine, if you can, being unable to feel the warmth of sunlight on your face, the cool relief of water on a hot day, the texture of food in your mouth, the comfort of another's touch. Baldur experienced none of these. Wine tasted like nothing. The finest foods were ash. The softest silk and roughest bark were equally absent to his nerves. He could see others experiencing sensation, could watch them flinch from pain or sigh with pleasure, but these were experiences as foreign to him as color to one born blind. For 100 years he had lived in this numbness, and each year had driven him deeper into a madness that even gods found disturbing. His search for feeling had taken him to every corner of the 9 realms and beyond. He had thrown himself into volcanoes in Muspelheim, hoping the primal fires might pierce his curse. He had stood naked in the void at the edge of existence, where reality itself grew thin, praying that nothingness might paradoxically grant him something. He had sought out the most powerful sorcerers, the oldest giants, even entities that existed between definitions, offering anything, everything, for even a moment of sensation. All had failed. The curse his mother had woven was perfect in its imperfection, absolute in its protection, complete in its cruelty. The other gods avoided Baldur during this period, uncomfortable with what he had become. Where once he had been the beloved god whose presence brought joy, he was now a reminder of how divine power could become divine punishment. His laughter had turned hollow. His smiles were performances of remembered emotion. His conversation always circled back to his condition like water spiraling down a drain. Even Thor, not known for his emotional sensitivity, found Baldur's company unsettling, describing it as drinking with a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead. Freya's imprisonment in Midgard was a different kind of torture, one that Odin had crafted with deliberate malice. The wings he had cut from her were not physical appendages, but manifestations of her divine nature, her ability to transcend the boundaries between realms. Without them, she was not just trapped in Midgard, but bound to it at a fundamental level. Every attempt to leave, whether through magic or mundane means, would result in an invisible force pulling her back, like a chain whose length she could never quite measure, but whose limit she would always reach. The Vanir goddess had constructed her home between spaces, in a pocket of reality that existed parallel to, but separate from normal Midgard. Here she could practice her magic, without Odin's direct observation, though she knew his ravens were always watching the borders of her prison, waiting for any sign of escape attempts. She had filled this space with the artifacts of her former life, weapons from her time as Valkyrie Queen, texts of Saedre magic that Odin had tried to destroy, and most importantly, the accumulated knowledge of healing arts that she had mastered over millennia. Her relationship with the mortals of Midgard was complex and often contradictory. As the Witch of the Woods, she would heal their ailments and ease their suffering, showing compassion that the Aesir had long abandoned. Yet she would also curse those who threatened her solitude with afflictions that would last generations, protecting her isolation with a ferocity that bordered on cruelty. She was simultaneously savior and monster, healer and hexer, the duality reflecting her own fractured nature as a goddess forced to live as less than mortal. The corruption of the Valkyries had reached a critical stage where even Sigrun, their queen and strongest among them, could no longer maintain control. Each Valkyrie had been bound to physical form through Odin's magic, their spirits locked into armor that served as both protection and prison. Over time, the constant exposure to death, the endless choosing of the slain, the weight of deciding who deserved glory and who deserved oblivion, had shattered their minds. They became trapped in their own realms, unable to leave, unable to die, unable to do anything but repeat the same actions in endless loops of madness. Gunnar in Tamar's corpse had become convinced that every warrior she met was the same person wearing different faces. Kara in the River Pass believed she was collecting souls for a war that had already ended. Geirdrifil grew fungi from her armor that whispered secrets in languages that predated speech. Each had developed their own particular insanity, their own unique break from reality, but all shared the same fundamental fracture. They could no longer distinguish between their duty and their punishment, between their service and their slavery. Thor's descent into alcoholism was not sudden but gradual, like erosion wearing away a mountain, one grain at a time. The god of thunder had always drunk heavily, but it had been celebratory, social, an enhancement to victory, rather than an escape from it. Now he drank to forget the faces of giants' children he had orphaned, to silence the questions that arose when the battle fury faded, to fill the growing emptiness where purpose once resided. His wife Sif watched this decline with the patient suffering of one who loved someone incapable of loving themselves. Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, had grown up in the shadow of their father's reputation and the weight of expectations they could never meet. Modi, despite his name meaning courage, was driven by cowardice disguised as cunning, always seeking the advantage, the surprise attack, the unfair fight. Magni, whose name meant strength, possessed physical power that rivaled his father's but lacked the will to use it decisively, always hesitating at crucial moments, as if afraid of his own capability. Their rivalry was vicious and constant, each viewing the other not as brother but as obstacle to their father's approval that would never come. The appearance of Jormungandr in the Lake of Nine was an event that defied explanation even for gods accustomed to the impossible. The world serpent was enormous beyond comprehension. His body coiled around Midgard itself, yet he had simply appeared one day as if he had always been there. When spoken to in the ancient tongue, he would respond with words that seemed to come from the future, references to events that had not occurred, names of beings not yet born. Mimir, when asked about this, would only say that time was more fluid than most realized, especially when it came to beings of Jormungandr's magnitude. The truth, known only to those who could read the deepest prophecies, was that Jormungandr had been sent backwards through time. During his final battle with Thor at Ragnarok, he existed as a living paradox, a creature who remembered his own death, who had experienced the end and been thrown back to witness the beginning. His presence in the Lake of Nine was both warning and confirmation, proof that Ragnarok would occur because it already had occurred, would occur, was occurring in a temporal loop that made causality meaningless. Faye's death was the pivot point around which all prophecy turned. Though few understood its significance at the time, she had planned even this, knowing that her passing would be the catalyst that set everything in motion. The sickness that took her was not natural, but self-inflicted, a poisoning so subtle that even she could not have cured it once begun. She needed to die at precisely the right moment, when Atreus was old enough to survive the journey ahead, but young enough to still discover his true nature, when Kratos had learned enough control to guide, but not enough peace to refuse the call to action. The yellow handprint she painted on their home before dying was more than mere decoration. It was a ward that would expire at exactly the moment needed, a magical timer counting down to when the protection around their forest would fail. She had calculated everything, the time it would take for her funeral pyre to burn, the days required to prepare for the journey to scatter her ashes, the exact moment when Baldur would arrive seeking her but finding Kratos instead. Every detail had been orchestrated with a precision that would have impressed even the Norns. The first snow of Fimbulwinter began to fall before Baldur's body had grown cold, as if nature itself had been waiting for permission to begin the end. These were not normal snowflakes, but crystallized fate, each one carrying a fragment of prophecy that would only be readable when they had accumulated in sufficient quantities. The temperature drop was immediate and severe, killing crops in the field, freezing rivers solid in moments, turning rain to ice before it could reach the ground. Animals fled southward in migrations that defied their natural patterns, and those that remained began to change, growing thicker fur, developing new behaviors, adapting to an eternal winter that their instincts somehow knew had arrived. He, Heimdall, watching all of this from his observatory at the Bifrost, saw more than he reported to Odin. His ability to perceive everything included things that should not be perceived, contradictions in reality, that suggested the foundations of existence were less stable than anyone believed. He saw Kratos before he arrived, saw Ragnarok before it began, saw his own death at the hands of a god who did not yet know he was a god. This knowledge drove him deeper into the cruel loyalty that had become his defining characteristic, as if by serving Odin perfectly enough, he could prevent the preventable, change the unchangeable, stop the unstoppable. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The world tree's leaves were falling out of season, each one black and brittle, as if burned from within. The waters of the Lake of Nine were developing currents that moved in impossible directions, sometimes flowing upward, sometimes standing still while appearing to rush past. The light in Alfheim flickered in patterns that, when mapped, spelled out words in the giant's language that translated simply to soon. Even the roots of Yggdrasil were retreating from certain realms, as if the tree itself was preparing for an impact it knew was coming. In their hidden cabin, as snow began to accumulate on the roof, Kratos felt something he had not experienced since leaving Greece, the weight of destiny pressing down like a physical force. He could not name it, could not explain it, but he knew that the peace he had found was ending. Atreus, young and unaware of his nature, excited about the journey to scatter his mother's ashes, had no idea that he was about to walk into a story that had been written before his birth, a prophecy that required him to become someone he could not yet imagine being. The first crack in Divinity had appeared, and through it, the end of everything was beginning to pour. The knock on the door was neither loud nor aggressive, yet it carried a weight that made the entire cabin shudder, as if reality itself was being politely asked to step aside. Kratos knew, in that moment before opening the door, that the past he had traveled so far to escape had finally caught up with him, though it wore a different face and spoke with a different accent. Baldur stood in the doorway, his eyes holding the desperate hunger of a starving man who had just caught the scent of food, though what he hungered for was not sustenance but sensation, not food but feeling, not life but the ability to experience it. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of misunderstanding. Baldur sought the giant he knew was hiding in these woods, the last guardian whose death would finally complete Odin's genocide. Kratos heard only another god come to drag him back into a cycle of violence he had sworn to leave behind. Each word they exchanged was correct in its own context, but catastrophic in combination, like two songs played simultaneously, creating discord instead of harmony. When Baldur spoke of knowing what Kratos was, he meant a giant. When Kratos heard this, he assumed his identity as the ghost of Sparta had been discovered. The fight that erupted was inevitable as sunrise, yet it shocked both combatants with its intensity. Baldur had not felt pain in a century, could not feel the blows that shattered trees and split the earth. Yet something about this stranger's resistance sparked hope in him for the first time in decades. Here was someone who fought like pain mattered, who moved with the economy of someone who had learned that every wound carried weight. Kratos, for his part, found himself facing an opponent who seemed to welcome every strike, who laughed when his jaw was broken, who seemed disappointed when his bones healed instantly. They destroyed the forest around the cabin with their battle, each impact reshaping geography, each collision creating sounds that echoed across realms. Kratos snapped Baldur's neck with the practiced ease of someone who had killed gods before, the motion automatic, trained into muscle memory through countless divine murders. Yet Baldur rose again, his neck straightening with a series of pops that sounded like breaking promises, his smile growing wider, as if death itself was just another sensation he could not experience. The stranger, as Kratos would think of him for some time, eventually departed, not because he was defeated, but because he was intrigued. He had found something unexpected, a quarry that might provide what decades of searching had failed to deliver. As he walked away, his final words carried a threat that was also a promise, that this was far from over, that what had begun with a knock would end with something far more final. The trees that had been shattered by their battle would never grow back quite right, their grain forever twisted into patterns that, viewed from above, spelled out words in a language that had been dead before the 9 realms were born. The journey to scatter Faye's ashes began immediately after, driven by Kratos' understanding that staying in one place had become impossible. The protective stave around their home had failed exactly as Faye had planned. Though Kratos did not know this, he saw only that they had been found, that isolation had failed, that movement was now necessary for survival. Atreus, excited by the prospect of finally leaving the forest that had been his entire world, had no understanding of the danger that movement brought, the exposure that came with stepping onto paths where gods and monsters waited. The revelation of Tyr's temple in the Lake of Nine changed everything Kratos thought he knew about his situation. This was not some isolated mythology cut off from the rest of existence, but a connected network of realms with pathways to everywhere, including potentially back to Greece, back to his past, back to everything he had tried to leave buried. The temple stood as proof that isolation was an illusion, that all pantheons were part of some greater whole that no individual god fully understood. Meeting Ymir provided context that transformed confusion into comprehension. The severed head, reanimated by Freya's magic after Kratos had carried it to her, became a repository of knowledge that explained the inexplicable. Through Mimir's stories, Kratos learned of Odin's paranoia, of Thor's brutality, of Baldur's curse, of the systematic genocide of the giants that made his own war against Olympus seem almost merciful by comparison. Every tale Mimir told added another piece to a puzzle that was forming a picture Kratos recognized all too well, a pantheon rotting from within, held together by fear and moving inexorably toward its own destruction. The confrontation with Modi and Magni at Tamir's corpse was brief but significant. These sons of Thor represented the next generation of Aesir brutality, yet they fell to Kratos and Atreus with surprising ease. Modi fled after watching his supposedly stronger brother die, carrying back to Asgard news that would shake the foundations of divine confidence. A god had killed a god, something that wasn't supposed to be possible in the Norse understanding of divinity. The natural order, already strained, began to buckle under the weight of this impossibility. Thor's response to his son's death was not the rage everyone expected, but something far more dangerous: cold calculation. He found Modi cowering in Midgard, beaten and humiliated by Atreus, and killed him with the casual disappointment of someone putting down a pet that had failed to perform. This was not a father mourning sons, but a craftsman discarding flawed tools. The thunder god then returned to Asgard to drink and wait, understanding that vengeance was not something to be rushed, but savored, planned, executed with the precision that had made him the greatest killer in the 9 realms. The journey through Helheim revealed truths that even Mimir had not known. The vision of Zeus that Atreus witnessed, the revelation of Kratos' past as the ghost of Sparta, the understanding that his father had destroyed an entire pantheon. These were puzzle pieces that transformed the picture entirely. Atreus began to understand that he was not the son of merely a warrior, but of a force of nature, a being who had killed abstractions like fear and death, who had murdered his own father and destroyed the very concept of Olympus. Yet it was in Jotunheim that the most crucial revelations emerged. The giants, in their final moments before extinction, had carved their entire history into a mountain, creating a monument to truth that no revision could alter. Here, Atreus learned his true name was Loki, that his mother had been the last guardian of the Jotunir, that everything about his life had been orchestrated to bring him to this moment of understanding. The prophecy showing Kratos' death in his son's arms was clear, undeniable, seemingly inevitable. But prophecies, as Kratos had learned in Greece, were tricky things. They showed what would happen if nothing changed, but the very act of seeing them created the possibility of change. He had defied the Sisters of Fate themselves, had traveled through time to prevent his own destiny, had broken the cycle that Zeus claimed was unbreakable. The Norse prophecy was just another chain to be shattered, another fate to be defied, another god's plan to be ruined through the simple act of choosing differently. The second confrontation with Baldur came at the worst possible moment, when truths were still raw and understanding incomplete. This time Baldur knew exactly who he was fighting, knew that Atreus was part giant, knew that killing them both would complete his father's genocide, and possibly earn him the reward of sensation. The battle was more desperate than the first, with Freya attempting to protect her son, despite his century of searching for death, with Atreus coming into powers he didn't understand, with Kratos fighting not just an enemy, but the weight of prophecy itself. The mistletoe arrow that broke Baldur's curse was such a small thing to carry such enormous consequence. A single arrowhead, overlooked by Frigg in her quest to protect her son, became the key that unlocked a century of numbness. When Baldur felt that first sensation of pain as the arrow pierced his hand, his scream was not of agony but of ecstasy, the cry of someone who had been holding their breath for 100 years, finally able to exhale. He felt everything at once: the cold of the wind, the heat of his blood, the texture of the ground beneath his feet, a sensory overload that drove him to tears of joy, even as it drove him to violence. The fight that followed was different, because now Baldur could be hurt, and being hurt was all he wanted. He threw himself at Kratos with abandon, savoring every broken bone, every torn muscle, every drop of blood that confirmed he was alive in a way he had forgotten was possible. But with sensation came vulnerability, and with vulnerability came mortality. When Kratos finally snapped his neck for the second and final time, Baldur died not with rage or regret, but with something approaching gratitude, his final words to Freya, carrying both forgiveness and accusation. Freya's transformation from grateful ally to vengeful enemy was instantaneous and absolute. She had spent a century protecting a son who wanted to die, and when death finally came, it was delivered by hands she had helped heal, by a man she had considered almost a friend. Her scream of rage shook snow from mountains, caused avalanches in distant realms, and announced to every being capable of hearing that the protective mother had become the avenging fury. She swore vengeance with the kind of certainty that reshapes reality around itself, the kind of promise that becomes prophecy through sheer force of will. The killing of Baldur triggered Fimbulwinter immediately, as if the seasonal mechanics of the world had been waiting for this specific death to begin their final malfunction. Snow began falling, not gradually, but suddenly, completely, as if winter had always been the only season and everything else had been a temporary aberration. This was not weather but weaponized climate, not winter but the absence of any possibility of spring. It would last 3 years, the prophecies said, 3 years of continuous winter before the final summer that would burn everything to ash. Throughout the 9 realms, the consequences cascaded, like dominoes that had been standing for millennia, waiting for the first one to fall. In Valhalla, the Einherjar felt a chill that no amount of mead could warm. In Asgard, Odin received the news of his son's death with a silence more terrifying than any scream. In Vanaheim, the Vanir began their final preparations for a war they had always known was coming. In Muspelheim, Surt felt the chains of his purpose beginning to loosen. The corruption of the Valkyries had reached its apex during this period of divine violence. Each one Kratos and Atreus freed was a victory not just over madness, but over the system that had created it. Sigrun, when finally released from her physical form, spoke of centuries of growing horror, watching her sisters descend into insanity while being powerless to help them. She had been forced to assign them to different realms, not as punishment, but as containment, hoping that isolation might slow their degradation. The fact that a foreign god had to free them, that Odin had abandoned them to eternal torment, was a truth that spread through the divine ranks like poison through veins. The discovery that Atreus could transform into animals, that he carried within him the shape-changing abilities that had made Loki legendary in prophecy, added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. He was simultaneously the son of Kratos and the prophesied Loki, carrying both Greek divine essence and giant heritage, a combination that had never existed before and therefore had no precedent in any prophecy. The journey back from Jotunheim was conducted in a silence heavier than any words could have been. Kratos had seen his own death prophesied. Atreus had learned his entire life was a carefully orchestrated deception, and both understood that the relative peace they had known was ending. The mural showing Kratos dying in Atreus's arms was not hidden or destroyed, but left visible, a constant reminder that prophecy existed, whether one believed in it or not, that fate had plans whether one agreed with them or not. Yet even as Ragnarok's countdown began with Fimbulwinter's arrival, something unprecedented was happening. The presence of Kratos, a Greek god in Norse lands, was creating ripples that no prophecy had accounted for. He was an anomaly in the pattern, a variable in an equation that had been balanced for millennia. Every action he took, every choice he made, caused small deviations from the prophesied path, not enough to prevent Ragnarok, perhaps, but enough to change its nature, its meaning, its outcome. The father and son returned to their cabin to find it covered in snow that would never melt, surrounded by a forest that would never again see spring, in a world that had begun its final march toward ending. Yet they also returned changed, understanding now that they were not merely witnesses to Ragnarok, but central players in its unfolding. The rising vengeance was not just Freya's oath or Odin's inevitable retaliation, but something larger, the vengeance of truth against lies, of prophecy against denial, of fate against those who would deny it. In Asgard, Odin sat on his throne, his ravens telling him of Baldur's death, of Kratos' true identity, of Atreus being Loki, and for the first time in his long existence, the All-Father felt not rage but fear, not the productive fear that drives preparation, but the deep existential terror of understanding that every measure he had taken to prevent Ragnarok had instead ensured it. The ghost of Sparta was in his realm. The prophesied Loki lived, Fimbulwinter had begun, and somewhere in the gathering snow, the wolf who would devour him was beginning to stir. 3 years of winter had transformed the 9 realms into something unrecognizable, a frozen monument to divine failure, where even hope seemed to crystallize and shatter in the endless cold. The snow didn't simply fall anymore. It accumulated with the weight of inevitability, burying entire civilizations beneath white silence that muffled even prayers. In Midgard, humans had progressed from rationing food to rationing warmth itself, gathering in ever smaller groups around fires that seemed to give less heat with each passing day, as if the very concept of warmth was being gradually erased from existence. The knock that came to Kratos' door on that 3rd year was different from Baldur's, where the dead god had knocked with desperate hope. Thor's hammer against wood carried the weight of divine authority, backed by personal rage. The god of thunder didn't wait for an answer, but entered with Odin at his side, though calling it entering was generous. When the door ceased to exist as anything but splinters and memory, they came not as conquerors, but as negotiators, though negotiations between gods always carried the implicit threat of apocalypse. Odin's appearance was calculated to disarm. He wore the guise of a wanderer, staff in hand, wide-brimmed hat, shadowing one eye, looking more like someone's grandfather than the architect of genocide. His voice, when he spoke, carried the reasonable tone of someone proposing a business arrangement rather than discussing the fate of existence. He wanted peace, he claimed, an end to the conflict that Kratos had begun by killing Baldur. All he asked in return was cooperation, specifically Atreus' cooperation in finding mask fragments that would reveal the truth behind everything. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in manipulation meeting immovable will. Odin spoke of knowledge, of understanding, of answers to questions that had plagued gods since before creation. He painted himself as a seeker of truth, unfairly maligned by those who didn't understand the burden of omniscience. Every word was chosen to appeal to Atreus's curiosity, while avoiding triggering Kratos' hostility. He even offered to let bygones be bygones regarding Baldur, Modi, and Magni, as if three dead gods were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding between neighbors. Thor, meanwhile, stood silent as a mountain, his presence alone communicating threat. He had come for blood, but was being held back by his father's leash, though how tight that leash was remained deliberately unclear. When he finally spoke, asking about the damage to his statue, the question carried layers of meaning, about respect, about power, about who truly ruled these lands. His sons were not mentioned directly, but their absence hung in the air, like the scent of rain before lightning strikes. The offer Odin made was sophisticated in its simplicity. Atreus would come to Asgard as a guest, not a prisoner. He would help locate mask fragments, using his giant heritage, his unique ability to read languages and signs that even Odin couldn't decipher. In return, Odin would share knowledge that Faye had hidden, truths about Atreus's nature that his parents had deliberately concealed. It was bait designed specifically for a young god struggling with identity, presented by someone who understood that curiosity could be a stronger chain than iron. Kratos' refusal was absolute, but Atreus' interest had been sparked, which was all Odin needed. The All-Father left peacefully, but not before demonstrating his power in subtle ways that showed he could have chosen violence, but deliberately hadn't. Thor's departure was more dramatic, involving a brief clash with Kratos that shattered the landscape, a preview of battles to come that ended with the Thunder God's hammer stopped inches from Kratos' head, held back only by Odin's command. The message was clear that mercy was a choice that could be revoked. The search for Tyr that followed was born from desperation to find another way forward. If the god of war and justice still lived, perhaps he could provide wisdom that didn't come with Odin's price tag. The journey to Svartalfheim's abandoned prison was fraught with evidence of Odin's desperation. The realm's dwarves were being worked to death, creating weapons for a war everyone knew was coming. Forges that had once produced art now manufactured only instruments of death, their smoke turning the realm's sky black with the ashes of creativity burned on the altar of survival. Finding Tyr alive in that prison should have been cause for celebration, but something was wrong from the first moment. He was too helpful, too eager, too perfectly aligned with what they needed him to be. He spoke of peace while counseling patience, urged caution while events demanded action, provided comfort while problems required solutions. Yet his knowledge of other pantheons was genuine. His understanding of Egyptian, Greek, and Celtic mythologies detailed enough to pass any test. The deception was perfect because it was built on a foundation of truth. Freya's pursuit of Kratos during this period had evolved from raw vengeance into something more complex. She hunted him across Midgard with the dedication of someone who had nothing left to lose, yet their encounters revealed her struggling with contradictions. She wanted him dead for killing Baldur, yet understood why he had done it. She hated him for taking her son, yet recognized that Baldur had been seeking death for a century. Her magic, powered by rage, was formidable enough to challenge even the ghost of Sparta, but it was undermined by a grief that made her attacks sometimes hesitant, as if she was fighting herself as much as him. The discovery of her Valkyrie wings' location became an obsession that paralleled her vendetta. Without them, she was powerful but limited, dangerous but contained. The wings were more than transportation. They were a fundamental part of her divine nature that Odin had severed and hidden. Every rune she carved, every spell she cast, every deal she made with entities better left undisturbed, was aimed at either killing Kratos or finding her wings, two goals that began to merge into a single desperate purpose. Atreus's secret journeys to Asgard represented a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. The boy who had promised his father honesty was sneaking away to meet with Odin, drawn by questions that gnawed at him like hunger. Who was Loki really? What did it mean to be part giant, part god, part something else entirely? Odin fed these questions carefully, providing just enough answers to keep Atreus returning while withholding enough to maintain dependency. He showed the boy fragments of prophecies that suggested Loki was meant for more than just triggering Ragnarok, that he had a destiny beyond being his father's son. The mask fragments themselves were objects of impossible power and terrible consequence. Each piece, when activated, showed glimpses of reality's source code, the fundamental mathematics that governed existence. But looking through them came at a cost measured in sanity and stability. Small tears in reality appeared wherever a fragment was used, rifts that leaked energies from spaces between spaces. Creatures that shouldn't exist began crawling through, beings of pure concept without physical form, ideas given hunger and set loose in a world unprepared for abstract predators. The creation of Draupnir, the spear that could defeat Heimdall, represented the kind of divine arms race that preceded all apocalypses. Brok and Sindri, the dwarf brothers whose smithing had armed gods and started wars, worked together for the first time in centuries to forge something that could pierce the unpeaceable, strike the unstrikable, kill the unkillable. The spear's creation required materials that didn't technically exist, borrowed from futures that might never come and pasts that had been erased. Its very existence was a violation of causality that would have consequences no one could foresee. Heimdall's increasing paranoia during this period transformed him from guardian to inquisitor. His ability to see everything had become a curse that showed him too much, including his own death, approaching with the inevitability of mathematics. He could see Kratos' intentions before Kratos formed them, could read Atreus' thoughts before they became conscious, could perceive the threads of fate weaving toward a conclusion that terrified him more than death itself. His cruelty, always present, became desperate, the viciousness of someone who knew their time was running out and blamed everyone else for the countdown. The revelation that Grela, the grandmother of Jotnar, still lived in Jotunheim was both hope and horror. She had survived Odin's genocide by becoming something that even gods feared to confront, a being of pure consumption that devoured not just flesh, but stories, memories, the very concept of those she ate. Her hunger had grown so vast that she had begun eating her own grandchildren, the last giants, to preserve them in the only way she could conceive. Meeting her required Atreus to confront what desperation could transform even the most loving beings into. The manipulation reached its crescendo when Odin arranged for Atreus to witness carefully curated scenes of Kratos' past. Using magic that bordered on time travel, he showed the boy his father's rampage through Olympus, the murder of Zeus, the destruction of entire civilizations in fits of rage. These visions were true but incomplete, showing violence without context, rage without reason, destruction without the desperation that drove it. It was truth weaponized into lies, history edited to serve propaganda's purpose. During this time, the mask's influence began spreading beyond those who sought it. People across the 9 realms reported dreams of geometric patterns that hurt to remember, visions of spaces with too many or too few dimensions, knowledge that evaporated the moment they tried to grasp it. The boundary between sleeping and waking became unclear for many, with some claiming they could see through reality's skin to the machinery beneath. Madness spread like a disease, but it was a madness that carried truth, even if that truth was too large for mortal minds to contain. The alliance between Kratos and Freya, when it finally came, was born from mutual recognition of manipulation's magnitude. She had spent 3 years seeking vengeance, only to realize that Odin had orchestrated even her rage, had counted on it, had used it as another tool to isolate and control. When she finally cornered Kratos in Vanaheim, when she had him at her mercy, she saw in his eyes not the killer of her son, but another parent Odin had twisted into a weapon against themselves. The choice to spare him, to ally with him, was simultaneously abandoning vengeance and embracing it, giving up revenge against Kratos to pursue it against Odin. The discovery of the real Tyr, when it came, would shatter what little trust remained between allies. But during these desperate months, the false Tyr played his role perfectly, always counseling patience when action was needed, always urging peace when war was inevitable, always being exactly helpful enough to avoid suspicion, while never helpful enough to change anything. Odin, wearing Tyr's face, sat among his enemies, learned their plans, shaped their decisions, and prepared for a final confrontation that he still believed he could win through cunning, if not strength. The desperation of this period was not just in the measures taken, but in the recognition that all measures might be insufficient. Gods were making alliances with enemies, breaking oaths that had stood for millennia, unleashing powers they didn't understand, all in service of preventing or ensuring an ending that seemed to approach regardless of anyone's actions. The very fabric of reality was being stretched to its breaking point, and everyone involved understood that when it snapped, the sound would be loud enough to deafen existence itself. The moment of revelation came not with dramatic confrontation, but with a simple question about souls. Brok, the blue dwarf, whose resurrection had left him incomplete, noticed what others had missed in their desperation for hope. The Tyr, who stood before them, cast no shadow in the realm between realms, left no spiritual footprint in spaces where every being, god or mortal, marked their passing. When Brok voiced this observation, the silence that followed was the sound of trust shattering like ice under spring's first sun, except there would be no spring, only the eternal winter of betrayal realized too late. Odin's transformation from Tyr to himself was not dramatic but casual, the way someone might remove a coat they'd worn too long. One moment stood the god of war and justice, the next revealed the All-Father in all his terrible glory, and the ease of the transition suggested he could have revealed himself at any time, had chosen this moment for maximum impact, maximum pain, maximum demonstration that he had been among them, learning their secrets, shaping their plans, for longer than they could bear to contemplate. The speed with which Odin moved to kill Brok was not the desperate lunge of someone caught, but the precise strike of someone executing a plan's final phase. His blade found the dwarf's heart with the certainty of prophecy, and Brok's death was different from any other, because he had no soul to preserve, no afterlife to enter, no possibility of resurrection or redemption. He simply ceased, becoming absence in a way that even gods found horrifying. Sindri's scream when his brother fell was the sound of someone watching not just death, but erasure, not just loss, but the impossibility of recovery. The All-Father's words, as he stood over Brok's body, were carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. He thanked them for their hospitality, for their trust, for teaching him so much about their plans and fears and weaknesses. Every conversation they'd had with Tyr, every moment of vulnerability, every strategic discussion had been Odin gathering intelligence with the patience of someone who had literally all the time in the world. He had sat at their table, eaten their food, listened to their stories, and all the while had been calculating the precise moment to reveal himself for maximum psychological destruction. But the true betrayal went deeper than mere deception. Odin revealed that he had been guiding events from the beginning, that Atreus's visits to Asgard weren't secret rebellions, but orchestrated meetings, that the mask fragments they'd been gathering were meant to be found, that even their resistance was part of his design. He spoke of Ragnarok not as something to be prevented, but as something to be controlled, directed, aimed like a weapon at targets of his choosing. The prophecy wasn't his enemy, he claimed, but his tool, and they had all been playing parts he had written for them. The revelation about Brok's incomplete resurrection was particularly cruel. Odin explained how he had prevented the dwarf's soul from fully returning when Sindri had brought him back, how he had kept a piece of it as insurance, as leverage, as a joke he'd been waiting years to deliver. Every moment of Brok's second life had been tainted by this theft, every achievement undermined by incompleteness, every joy shadowed by an absence he couldn't name but always felt. The resurrection Sindri had considered his greatest accomplishment was revealed as his greatest failure, orchestrated by an enemy he hadn't known existed. Atreus's face, during these revelations, showed the complete destruction of innocence. Every lesson Odin had taught him, every moment of grandfather-like guidance, every answer to questions about his nature and purpose, all of it was revealed as manipulation so complete that the boy couldn't distinguish between what thoughts were his own and what had been planted. The mask fragment in his possession suddenly felt like a parasite, something that had been reading him while he thought he was reading it, learning his deepest nature to better control him. The escape Odin made from Sindri's house was not flight, but departure, walking away with the confidence of someone who had accomplished their mission. He had the final mask fragment taken from Atreus with the ease of an adult taking a toy from a child. He had shattered their alliance, murdered one of their own in a way that prevented any form of recovery, and revealed that their entire resistance had been a performance he had been directing. As he vanished into the realm between realms, his parting words were an invitation to the final act, telling them where to find him when they were ready to play their parts in the ending he had scripted. Sindri's transformation in the moments after his brother's death was horrifying to witness. The cheerful, helpful Smith became something else entirely, a being of pure grief given form and purpose. He cradled Brok's body with hands that had forged weapons for gods, but could not forge a way to bring back someone with no soul to retrieve. His tears, when they came, hissed where they hit the ground, as if his sorrow was so intense it had become corrosive. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat certainty of someone whose entire worldview had just been revealed as fantasy. The systematic nature of Odin's betrayal became clear as they reviewed past events with new understanding. Every victory they had thought they'd won had been allowed. Every discovery they'd made had been planned. The liberation of Freya's wings, which had seemed like such a triumph, had occurred exactly when Odin needed another powerful piece on the board to maintain the illusion of genuine conflict. The forging of Draupnir, which they thought would give them an advantage, had required materials that Odin had ensured were available at precisely the right moment. Thor's growing disillusionment with his father, which they had hoped to exploit, was revealed to be another manipulation. Odin had been deliberately cruel to his son, pushing him toward a breaking point that would come exactly when the All-Father needed it to. Every harsh word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of paternal disappointment had been calculated to create a specific psychological state that would manifest at a predetermined moment. Thor's potential redemption wasn't a wild card, but a known quantity in Odin's equation. The discovery that Odin had been experimenting with the mask fragments on captive giants, the few survivors he had kept hidden for exactly this purpose, added another layer of horror to his betrayals. These giants, driven mad by exposure to fundamental truth, had been prophesying in languages that predated speech, drawing diagrams of realities that couldn't exist, screaming numbers that described concepts mathematics hadn't invented yet. They were being used as filters for knowledge too dangerous for even Odin to absorb directly, their sanity sacrificed to his understanding. Sif and Thrud's position in Asgard became increasingly untenable as Odin's true nature revealed itself even to those who had served him faithfully. The All-Father's treatment of his own family was exposed as purely transactional, each member valued only for their utility, discarded the moment they became liabilities. Sif watched her husband Thor struggle with the growing realization that his father's love had always been conditional, always strategic, always a lie wrapped in the appearance of paternal affection. The fragments of truth about Odin's original sin began surfacing from sources that had been silent for millennia. He hadn't just killed Ymir for creation, but had done so after learning everything the primordial giant knew, after gaining his trust, after pretending to be his friend. The pattern of betrayal wasn't new, but fundamental to Odin's nature, the original template from which all his other deceptions had grown. Every relationship he had ever formed had been poisoned from inception by his inability to value others beyond their usefulness to his goals. Freya's rage at learning about Odin's deception was volcanic, but it was tempered by a horrible understanding. She had been married to him, had borne his children, had loved him before learning his nature, and now realized that even her rebellion had been part of his plan. Her curse, her imprisonment in Midgard, her son's death, her quest for vengeance, all of it had been moves in a game where Odin controlled both sides of the board. The wings she had fought so hard to reclaim had been returned to her at exactly the moment Odin needed her to have them. The preparation for the final assault on Asgard took place under a cloud of distrust that Odin's betrayal had seeded. How could they plan when any of them might be another tear, another deception waiting to be revealed? How could they trust their own thoughts when Odin had demonstrated his ability to shape minds without their knowledge? The alliance that formed was built not on trust, but on the mutual recognition that they had all been victims of the same divine predator, and that only together could they hope to end his predations. Kratos' response to the betrayal was perhaps the most telling. He had expected it, had been waiting for it, had recognized in Odin the same manipulative nature that had defined Zeus and the Olympians. The surprise wasn't that Odin had betrayed them, but that anyone had expected otherwise. Gods, in his experience, were incapable of genuine connection, seeing others only as tools or threats, pieces to be moved or obstacles to be removed. The fact that Odin had been more sophisticated in his manipulations than Zeus had been merely meant the Norse All-Father had had more time to perfect his techniques. The revelation that the real Tyr had been alive all along, hidden in a prison even Odin had forgotten about, added a final twist to the betrayal. The god of war and justice had been replaced so thoroughly that even his existence had been erased from consideration. When they finally found him, broken but unbroken, aware of his usurper but unable to warn anyone, the full scope of Odin's deception became clear. He hadn't just been playing them against each other, but had been playing multiple games simultaneously, each deception layered on others, each betrayal enabling future betrayals. The preparation for Ragnarok was no longer about preventing prophecy, but about ensuring it happened on their terms rather than Odin's. The All-Father believed he could control the ending, could direct the destruction to preserve his power while eliminating his enemies. But his great betrayal had done something he hadn't calculated, for it had united every force in the 9 realms against him, had given them a common purpose that transcended their individual grievances, had transformed a collection of enemies into an army with singular focus. As they prepared for the final battle, Sindri worked in silence, forging weapons with a fury that made the metal scream. He would not speak to anyone, could not forgive them for trusting the false Tyr, could not forgive himself for not seeing through the deception in time to save his brother. His grief had transformed into something harder than any material he had ever worked with, a rage so pure it could have been used to forge weapons capable of killing concepts themselves. When he finally looked up from his work, his eyes held nothing but the promise of an ending, though whose ending remained to be seen. The war council at Sindri's house was a gathering of the desperate and the damned, each participant carrying wounds that would never heal, betrayals that could never be forgiven, losses that had transformed them into weapons aimed at Asgard's throat. The empty chair where Brok should have sat was the loudest presence in the room, a void that spoke more eloquently than any speech about what Odin had taken from them and what they intended to take in return. Sindri himself was absent, locked in his forge, the sound of his hammer providing a rhythmic backdrop to their planning, like a funeral drum that never stopped. Freya stood transformed, her Valkyrie wings restored but changed. No longer the pure white of Asgard's servant, but black as the space between stars, each feather edged with the green of Vanir magic that Odin had tried to extinguish. She had reclaimed them in Vanaheim through a ritual that required her to confront every moment of her marriage to Odin, every compromise she had made, every piece of herself she had surrendered for a love that had never existed. The wings were not just transportation but a declaration that she was no longer anyone's queen, anyone's mother, anyone's victim, but solely an instrument of ending. The gathering of allies revealed how thoroughly Odin's tyranny had created its own opposition. Freyr arrived with the last free Vanir, gods of nature, who had watched Odin pervert the natural order for so long that they had begun to embody endings rather than growth. Hildisvini, the great boar who served as Freyr's mount and advisor, spoke in a language older than words about cycles that had been broken and needed to be completed. From Alfheim came both light and dark elves, their eternal war suspended in recognition of a greater threat, though they stood on opposite sides of the room, as if proximity might reignite their conflict. The plan that emerged was not complex, because complexity required trust, and trust had died with Brock. They would assault Asgard directly, using the realm towers that Odin believed he controlled, but which still responded to Tyr's original programming. The real Tyr, recovered from his hidden prison, provided knowledge of backdoors and overrides that his imposter had never known existed. His presence was both inspiring and unsettling, a reminder of how thoroughly they had been deceived, how completely Odin had replaced truth with lies. But the most crucial element of their assault came from an unexpected source. Angrboda, the last free giant in Jotunheim, revealed that she had been preserving more than just memories. In her cave, protected by magic that existed outside the normal flow of time, she had been keeping souls in marbles, the essential essence of beings waiting to be reborn when the cycle turned. Among these was Fenrir, the great wolf who prophecy claimed would devour Odin, whose binding had been one of the All-Father's first crimes against fate. The process of placing Fenrir's soul into Garm, the hound who guarded Helheim's gates, was not resurrection but transformation. Atreus, accepting his role as Loki, performed the ritual with an understanding that transcended his years. He was not just moving a soul between bodies, but fulfilling a prophecy that had been waiting since before his birth. When Fenrir opened new eyes in Garm's massive frame, the howl that emerged shook snow from mountains in all 9 realms, a sound that announced to everyone capable of hearing that the final act had begun. The assault on Asgard required something more fundamental than warriors or weapons. It required Surt to become what he had always been destined to be, not just the fire giant who guarded Muspelheim, but Ragnarok itself, the ending given form and purpose. The conversation between Kratos and Surt was brief but profound, 2 beings who understood that existence was pain, discussing whether ending was mercy. Surtur's agreement came not from desire for destruction, but from love, specifically his love for Sinmara, his wife whose heart he carried as his own, whose essence would merge with his to become the flame that would consume creation. The journey through the realm tower toward Asgard was not travel, but transformation. Each realm they passed through was already showing signs of breakdown. In Vanaheim, the great tree that centered the realm was weeping sap that looked like blood. In Alfheim, the light had begun pulsing in patterns that suggested it was sending a message, though in a language no one could read. Helheim's dead were rising without being called, drawn by an instinct that told them the boundaries between life and death were about to become meaningless. When they emerged in Asgard, the realm of the gods was already in chaos. Not from their assault, which hadn't yet begun, but from internal collapse as the Aesir realized what Odin had done, what he had sacrificed, what he had become in his obsession with preventing prophecy. The Einherjar, Those glorious dead, who had been training for Ragnarok for centuries, stood confused as their purpose collapsed into paradox. They had been preparing to prevent the end, but their preparation had become part of the ending itself. The great wall of Asgard, built by a giant whom Thor had murdered rather than pay, began to crack not from external assault but from internal contradiction. It had been constructed to keep threats out, but the greatest threat had always been within, had always been the one who ordered its construction. The irony was lost on no one, as the wall began to crumble, revealing that Asgard's greatest defense had always been its greatest vulnerability, that isolation had bred not strength, but weakness. Thrud's decision to stand against her grandfather was the moment the Aesir truly began to die as a unified force. The daughter of Thor, trained to be the perfect warrior, chose to defend those her family had oppressed, rather than the realm that had given her everything but truth. Her defection was not dramatic but quiet, simply walking across the battlefield to stand with Kratos and Atreus, her movement speaking louder than any declaration that the age of blind loyalty to Asgard had ended. Sif's transformation from loyal wife to revolutionary came when she saw Odin's true intentions for Thor. Her husband was not meant to survive Ragnarok as Odin's enforcer, but to die as his final sacrifice, one last piece of divine power for the All-Father to consume in his attempt to transcend the ending. Every cruel word Odin had spoken to Thor, every disappointment expressed, had been designed to create a specific psychological state that would make Thor's divine essence easier to absorb at the crucial moment. The battle itself was not the glorious combat of songs, but the ugly reality of endings. Einherjar fought Einherjar as confusion spread about which side served Asgard's true interests. Valkyries, who had been freed from their madness, fought those still loyal to Odin, sister against sister in aerial combat that painted the sky with divine blood. The light elves and dark elves, finally given a common enemy, discovered that their magics complemented rather than contradicted, creating combinations that had been impossible during their eternal war. Heimdall's last stand at the Bifrost was perhaps the most tragic element of the spiral. He could see everything, including his own death approaching with mathematical certainty, yet he could not stop defending a master who had never valued him beyond his usefulness. His all-seeing gaze showed him the truth of Odin's nature, the completeness of the All-Father's betrayal, the futility of resistance, yet he fought anyway because he had been so thoroughly shaped by his service that he couldn't imagine existence without it. When Kratos' spear Draupnir finally found Heimdall's heart, the death was almost merciful. For the first time in his existence, Heimdall couldn't see what came next, couldn't perceive the future, couldn't know everything. His last words were not defiance, but relief, thanking Kratos for giving him the one experience he had never had, surprise. The horn Gjallarhorn fell from his dying hands. Its call no longer needed to announce Ragnarok, since Ragnarok had already arrived. The revelation that Odin had been consuming other gods' power, not just hoarding it, but literally incorporating it into himself, explained the strange absences throughout Asgard. Minor gods, who had supposedly left on missions, had been devoured, their essence absorbed to fuel Odin's preparations for transcendence. He had been hollowing out his own pantheon from within, maintaining the appearance of strength while cannibalizing the foundation of his power. The Aesir hadn't been dying in battle, but disappearing into their All-Father's endless hunger for power. The world tree itself began to revolt against what was happening. Yggdrasil's branches, which had connected the realms since creation, started withdrawing from Asgard, like fingers pulling away from flame. The great tree recognized that one of its realms had become cancerous, that Odin's presence was poisoning the entire system, that amputation might be the only way to save the whole. Leaves fell, not in autumn patterns, but in deliberate messages, spelling out in the giant's language a single word repeated endlessly: enough. Fenrir's arrival on the battlefield changed everything. The wolf that had been bound since youth, grown massive in Garm's body, but retaining his own soul, moved through Asgard's defenders like death itself, given legs and purpose. He was not seeking random destruction, but hunting for one specific target: the grandfather who had chained him for the crime of existing, who had stolen his youth for fear of a prophecy that his fear had made inevitable. Every step closer to Odin was a step toward completing a circle that had been drawn before any of them were born. The collapse accelerated when the foundation of lies finally gave way. Citizens of Asgard, those who had lived their entire existences believing in the Aesir's benevolence, saw their gods for what they truly were. The golden halls were revealed as prisons, the glorious purposes as slavery, the promised rewards as chains. Some fled toward the realm tower, seeking escape to anywhere else. Others simply sat down where they were, overwhelmed by the recognition that everything they had believed was fabrication. Reality itself began to fray around the edges of the conflict. The mask fragments Odin had gathered were resonating with each other, creating zones where the fundamental laws of existence became suggestions rather than rules. Warriors would age decades in seconds or become children again. Weapons would transform into concepts mid-swing. The ground would occasionally forget to be solid, dropping combatants into voids that hadn't existed moments before. The boundary between life and death became so unclear that some fighters didn't realize they had been killed until they tried to pick up weapons their hands passed through. As the spiral tightened toward its center, toward the final confrontation everyone knew was coming, the 9 realms held their breath, not metaphorically but literally, as if existence itself was pausing before the plunge, gathering itself for an ending that would either destroy everything or transform it into something unrecognizable. In the eye of this storm stood Odin, no longer pretending to be anything other than what he was, a god so afraid of ending that he had become ending itself, so terrified of death that he had killed everything around him, so desperate for control that he had orchestrated his own loss of it. The confrontation between Kratos and Thor began not with thunder but with silence. 2 fathers who had lost too much standing in the ruins of what gods had built, measuring each other across a distance that could be crossed in a heartbeat but contained the weight of prophecy itself. Thor's hammer Mjolnir hung at his side like a sleeping disaster, while Kratos' axe remained on his back, both weapons momentarily forgotten as these 2 forces of destruction recognized something in each other that transcended their roles as enemies. Thor spoke first, his voice carrying none of the boastful fury that had defined him for centuries, but instead a weariness that seemed to pull words from depths he had never explored. He talked about Modi and Magni, not as the disappointments Odin had labeled them, but as sons he had failed, boys he had shaped into weapons, because that was all he knew how to create. He spoke of battles that had once thrilled him, now feeling like repetition, of victory that tasted like ash, of a throne in Asgard that felt more like a cage with every passing year. This was not the god of thunder, but a father exhausted by the weight of expectations he had never chosen, but had inherited like a disease. Kratos listened without interrupting, recognizing in Thor's words an echo of his own journey from rage to regret. When he finally responded, it was not with threats or challenges, but with a simple truth that he had learned through destroying one pantheon and watching another decay. He told Thor that prophecy was not chain but choice, that sons did not have to become their fathers, that it was possible to stop being a monster even after committing monstrous acts. The conversation was brief, perhaps lasting only moments, but it contained the weight of lifetimes spent in service to cycles neither had created but both had perpetuated. When they finally fought, it was with the resignation of those fulfilling an obligation rather than a desire. Their first collision shattered what remained of Asgard's great hall, Mjolnir meeting Leviathan in an impact that created a sound like reality tearing, Thor's lightning came not in bolts but in waves, electricity given mass and intention, while Kratos' frost spread not as ice, but as the absence of heat itself, entropy weaponized into something that could freeze thought mid-formation. They moved through Asgard's architecture like forces of nature, which they were, leaving destruction that would never be repaired, because there would be no one left to repair it. The battle escalated through phases that seemed to recapitulate the history of divine warfare. They fought with weapons, then with fists, then with the raw essence of their divine natures. Thor became lightning itself, existing as electricity given consciousness, while Kratos channeled the rage that had once destroyed Olympus, that primal fury that preceded thought and survived reason. Buildings didn't collapse around them so much as cease, matter giving up its coherence rather than endure the forces being unleashed. Citizens of Asgard, those who hadn't fled, simply evaporated when caught too close to the conflict, their existence unable to withstand proximity to such concentrated violence. Yet throughout the battle, something was different from their previous encounters. Neither was trying to kill the other with the desperate finality that had defined their earlier clash. They were fighting because they had to, because prophecy demanded it, because everyone expected it, but both seemed to be looking for something else, a way out of the script they had been handed. Their attacks, devastating as they were, pulled back at crucial moments. Their defenses, formidable as they appeared, contained deliberate openings. They were performing violence rather than embodying it, and both knew the other knew. The moment of transformation came when Odin's voice cut through their battle like a blade through silk. The All-Father stood watching from his throne, which he had moved to the battlefield's edge to better observe his son's performance. His critique was casual, almost bored, discussing Thor's technique, as if commenting on a training exercise rather than a battle for the fate of existence. He pointed out openings Thor had missed, opportunities for cruelty he had foregone, moments when mercy had weakened what should have been killing blows. Thor's response to his father's criticism was not the usual shameful acceptance, but something new, dangerous in its quietness. He stopped fighting entirely, letting Mjolnir fall to his side, and turned to face Odin with eyes that held a clarity they had lacked for centuries. The alcohol that had clouded his thoughts seemed to burn away in the face of a realization so profound it restructured his entire existence. He saw, finally and completely, what he had been to his father, not a son but a tool, not family but function, not loved but utilized. When Thor spoke, his words were simple, but carried the weight of divine revolution. He told Odin he was done, that he would no longer be the All-Father's destroyer, his monster, his extension of will wrapped in muscle and lightning. He spoke of wanting to be better, for himself, for his surviving family, for the memory of sons he had failed. He dropped Mjolnir entirely, the weapon that had defined him falling to the ground with a sound like abandonment itself, and turned his back on both his father and the fight. Odin's response was immediate and without hesitation. Gungnir, the spear that never missed, found Thor's heart before the god of thunder had taken 3 steps. The weapon emerged from his chest like a statement of ownership. Odin reclaiming the power he had invested in his son with the casual efficiency of someone closing an account. Thor's last words were not for his father, but for Thrud, his daughter who was watching from the battlefield's edge, telling her to be better than he had been, to choose her own path, to remember that blood did not determine destiny. The death of Thor at his father's hand shifted something fundamental in the battle's nature. This was no longer a conflict between opposing forces, but a revelation of what Odin truly was, had always been, would always be. The assembled armies, both those attacking and defending Asgard, paused in their combat to witness something that violated even divine understanding of family, power, and purpose. A father had killed his son, not in rage or accident, but with the deliberation of someone removing an obstacle, and the casualness of the act revealed more about Odin's nature than any prophecy ever could. Thrud's scream when her father fell was not just grief, but transformation. The young goddess, who had been raised on stories of her grandfather's wisdom and her father's strength, saw both myths die in a single moment. She rushed to Thor's body, trying to lift Mjolnir to defend him even in death, but the hammer would not move for her. Not yet, not until she had earned it through choices rather than inheritance. Her tears fell on her father's face, and where they landed, small flowers grew, life insisting on itself even in the midst of ending. The three-way battle that followed was less combat than reckoning. Kratos, Freya, and Atreus faced Odin not as individuals, but as representations of everything the All-Father had tried to control and failed to understand. Kratos brought the experience of someone who had destroyed one pantheon and learned from it. Freya carried the fury of a goddess betrayed by someone she had once loved. Atreus embodied the future that Odin had tried to script but could not fully control. Together they were past, present, and future, united against someone who had tried to be all three. Odin fought with everything he had accumulated over millennia. He shapeshifted through forms both divine and monstrous, became elements and concepts, wielded magic that predated the 9 realms and science that shouldn't exist yet. His ravens became extensions of his will, each one a fragment of his consciousness capable of independent action. He spoke words that were themselves weapons, syllables that rewrote reality in their utterance, sentences that could unmake existence if completed. This was not just the All-Father, but everything the All-Father had consumed, stolen, learned, and hoarded, given violent expression. The mask, completed now, despite Atreus having destroyed what they thought was a crucial piece, revealed its true purpose. It didn't show the truth behind everything, but instead showed that there was no truth, only perspective, only interpretation, only the meaning that conscious beings imposed on meaningless existence. Odin had sought ultimate knowledge and found ultimate absence, had searched for the answer and discovered there was no question, had pursued meaning and found only void. The revelation had broken something in him, transformed his desire for control into a need to impose meaning through force. Yet even as Odin displayed power that could reshape reality, he was fighting 3 opponents who had each found something he never could: acceptance. Kratos had accepted his nature as a killer and chosen to be more. Freya had accepted her losses and transformed grief into purpose. Atreus had accepted his identity as Loki without letting it define his choices. They fought not with desperation, but with clarity, not seeking to prevent ending, but to ensure it meant something. The moment of victory came not through strength, but through understanding. When Atreus realized the mask showed nothing, because it reflected the viewer's own emptiness or fullness, he made a choice that Odin could never have made. He destroyed it completely, accepting that some knowledge was not meant to be possessed, that some questions were more valuable than their answers, that mystery was not weakness, but the space where meaning could grow. The destruction of the mask caused reality to snap back like a rubber band released, and Odin, who had tied so much of himself to its revelations, screamed as if physically wounded. The combined assault that followed was not coordinated, but harmonious. Kratos' axe found gaps in Odin's defenses that Freya's magic had created, while Atreus' arrows carried truths that pierced deeper than their physical points. They fought not as individuals taking turns, but as aspects of a single intention, the determination to end, not just Odin, but what Odin represented, the tyranny of those who would rather rule ashes than share paradise. When Odin finally fell, it was not with the drama of divine death, but with the quietness of exhaustion. His last words were not curses or pleas, but questions, asking why they couldn't see what he had seen, why they chose meaning over truth, why they preferred beautiful lies to ugly reality. He genuinely could not understand how anyone could face the absence he had discovered and choose to continue anyway, how anyone could know that existence was meaningless and still find meaning in existence. Freya's binding of Odin's soul into a marble was not just imprisonment, but preservation of a warning. She held in her hand everything the All-Father had been, compressed into a sphere small enough to fit in a pocket, but heavy enough to bend space around it. The question of what to do with this condensed evil, this crystallized tyranny, hung in the air until Sindri appeared as if from nowhere, his approach so quiet that even gods hadn't heard it. The dwarf took Odin's soul without asking, without explaining, without acknowledging anyone else's presence. He placed it on an anvil that appeared from the same nowhere he had emerged from, raised a hammer that seemed too large for his arms to lift, and brought it down with all the grief and rage that Brock's death had created. The marble shattered into dust so fine it ceased to exist before reaching the ground, and with it went Odin, not just killed but erased, not just ended but undone, removed from existence so thoroughly that even memory of him would fade like morning mist. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that exists not just in the absence of sound, but in the absence of the possibility of sound. Everyone present understood that they had witnessed not just the death of a god, but the death of an age, not just the end of Odin, but the end of everything Odin had built, maintained, and represented. The Nine Realms tyrant was gone, but so was their structure, their order, their definition. What remained was potential without shape, future without prophecy, existence without predetermined meaning. Surtur's transformation into Ragnarok itself was not violent but tender, a giant embracing his purpose with the same gentleness he had once embraced his wife. When he merged with Sinmara's heart, which he had carried for so long, the reunion was both ending and beginning, destruction and creation wrapped around each other, like lovers who had been separated by existence itself. The flame that emerged from their union was not ordinary fire, but the conceptual end of things, heat that didn't burn matter, but rather convinced it to stop being matter, to release its hold on form and return to the potential from which it had emerged. The destruction of Asgard was both instantaneous and eternal. From one perspective, the realm ceased to exist the moment Surtur's blade pierced its heart. From another, it was still dying, would always be dying, caught in a moment of unbecoming that stretched across all possible timelines. Those who escaped through the realm tower looked back to see not ruins, but absence, a space where reality had given up trying to maintain itself. The golden halls didn't collapse, but rather forgot they had ever existed, their memory fading from the universe like a dream upon waking. The escape through the collapsing realm tower was a journey through dissolution itself. Each step forward required moving through spaces that were losing their definition, where up and down became suggestions, where forward and backward lost their distinction. Freyr chose to remain behind, holding the path open for others to escape. His last act a reversal of his nature. The god of fertility and growth became the god of endings, ensuring that destruction had purpose, that sacrifice meant something, that even apocalypse could be an act of love. When the survivors emerged in Midgard, they found a world that had been waiting for gods to stop interfering with it. The eternal winter of Fimbulwinter continued, but without divine malice behind it. It was just weather, harsh but natural, difficult but not impossible. The humans who had survived 3 years of continuous winter had evolved beyond their need for divine intervention. They had learned to grow food in ice, to find warmth in community rather than fire, to create their own meaning rather than waiting for gods to provide it. Angerboda stood in Ironwood, surrounded by marbles that contained the souls of giants, the preserved essence of a race that Odin had tried to exterminate. She had been the keeper of potential, maintaining not just memory but possibility, ensuring that genocide could be reversed, that extinction was temporary, that even death could be undone if someone cared enough to preserve what mattered. Each marble was a complete life, an entire history, a whole universe of experience compressed into something that could be held but never fully grasped. The surviving Aesir were few and transformed by loss. Sif stood where Asgard had been, looking at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. She had lost a husband to his father's cruelty, lost a realm to its ruler's paranoia, lost a pantheon to its own contradictions. Yet she remained, and in remaining became something new, not the goddess of earth and marriage, but the goddess of aftermath, of what comes after everything else has ended. Her choice to continue existing when existence seemed pointless was itself a form of heroism that required no weapons or victories. Thrud's inheritance was not Mjolnir, which remained where Thor had dropped it, but something more profound. She inherited the possibility of being different, of choosing not to continue the cycles that had defined divine existence for millennia. She was strong like her father, but chose not to use that strength for destruction. She was wise like her grandmother, but chose not to use that wisdom for manipulation. She was young enough to imagine different ways of being divine, ways that didn't require worship or fear or sacrifice, but simply existed alongside mortal life rather than above it. Vidar, the silent god who had survived through saying nothing, finally spoke, and his words carried the weight of accumulated observation. He had watched everything, participated in nothing, and now served as witness to what passivity in the face of tyranny accomplished. His silence had not protected him from complicity. His non-participation had been its own form of participation. He spoke of responsibility that extended beyond action to inaction, of guilt that came not from what one did, but from what one allowed to happen. Freya's role as the last leader of the Vanir was not one she had sought, but one that necessity had created. The Vanir way, the path of natural magic and growth, had survived Odin's corruption, but emerged scarred and changed. She led not through commands, but through example, showing that power could heal rather than harm, that strength could protect rather than dominate, that divinity could serve rather than rule. Her transformation from queen to witch to warrior to leader was complete, each phase building on the last rather than replacing it. The Huldra brothers remained split by Brock's death, in ways that seemed irreparable. Sindri had disappeared after destroying Odin's soul, vanishing into whatever space between spaces dwarves go when they want to stop existing without actually dying. His forge remained but cold, his tools abandoned mid-creation, his absence a wound in reality that refused to heal. Those who had known both brothers said that when Brock died, Sindri had too, but his body hadn't realized it yet, continuing through motions that no longer had meaning. The fate of the Nine Realms connections became clear as the World Tree began its slow recovery. Yggdrasil had been wounded by the violence done in its branches, traumatized by the weight of so much divine cruelty. The paths between realms that had once been clear became maze-like and uncertain. Travel was still possible, but no longer guaranteed. The tree itself seemed to be reconsidering whether connection between realms was beneficial or whether isolation might be preferable to the conflicts that connection enabled. Valhalla's transformation was perhaps the most unexpected consequence of Odin's fall. Without the All-Father's will maintaining its purpose, the Great Hall began to evolve into something unprecedented. It became not a place of eternal battle, but eternal reflection, where the Einherjar could finally rest, finally think, finally process the violence they had been trapped in for centuries. Some chose to fade away, their purpose completed. Others chose to remain but changed, becoming counselors and teachers rather than warriors, sharing hard-won wisdom about the cost of glory. The empty throne of Asgard became a symbol more powerful than any occupied seat could have been. Various beings approached it, considered claiming it, then walked away understanding that the age of singular divine rule had ended. Power would need to be shared, or it would corrupt. Authority would need to be earned repeatedly, rather than inherited permanently. The throne remained, slowly being covered by snow that somehow fell in a realm that no longer fully existed, a monument to the danger of absolute power. New forms of governance began emerging organically, across the realms. Councils replaced kings, assemblies replaced autocrats, and collective decision-making replaced divine decree. It was messy and inefficient, and sometimes failed completely. But it was also genuine in a way that God rule had never been. Mortals and minor deities learned to solve problems without waiting for salvation from above, discovered strength in cooperation that had been impossible under competition for divine favor. The question of what to do with the remnants of divine power became pressing as various artifacts and weapons lay unclaimed. Mjolnir remained where Thor had dropped it, too heavy for anyone to lift, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Mjolnir had vanished with Odin's destruction, but other weapons remained, each one capable of enormous destruction in the wrong hands. An informal agreement emerged to leave them where they lay, monuments to a violent age that no one wanted to repeat. In Midgard, where Kratos and Atreus had returned, the rebuilding was not of structures, but of relationships. Father and son had to learn to exist without the pressure of prophecy, without the weight of destiny, without the script that had been guiding their actions. They were free in a way that was both liberating and terrifying, able to choose their path without knowing where it led. The mural that had shown Kratos dying in his son's arms remained in Jotunheim, but prophecy without belief was just art. Prediction without power was just suggestion. Atreus made the choice to leave, not because of conflict, but because of calling. The giants were out there, scattered across mythologies, hidden in corners of existence that the Norse cosmology had barely touched. He would find them, gather them, help them remember who they were and what they could become. His departure was not abandonment, but growth, not rejection, but evolution. Loki was leaving, but Atreus would always be Kratos' son, carrying lessons learned in blood and snow into whatever future he would help create. The worship of Kratos that emerged in Midgard was nothing he had sought, and everything he had earned, not through demanding it, but through protecting without asking for payment, through fighting gods who had tormented mortals, through choosing to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. The murals painted of him showed not the ghost of Sparta, but the god of hope, not the destroyer, but the protector, not the rage, but the control. He had become what he had never thought possible, a god worthy of worship because he didn't want it. Sköllr's rise to leadership in Midgard represented the kind of human ambition that thrived in Divinity's absence. He united settlements not through force, but through promise, not of divine protection, but of human cooperation. His kingdom would not last forever. Nothing mortal could, but it would last long enough to prove that humanity didn't need gods to create civilization, only the belief that tomorrow could be better than today if they worked to make it so. The prophecy of Ragnarok had been simultaneously fulfilled and subverted in ways that would take scholars generations to fully understand. Every major event had occurred exactly as foretold, yet differently than expected, as if fate itself had been following the letter of prophecy while ignoring its spirit. Thor had died to blood and thunder, but it was his father's spear rather than the world serpent's poison. Odin had been consumed at Ragnarok, but by grief and hammer rather than wolf's jaws. The world had ended in fire, but Surtur's flames had burned with love rather than hatred. Prophecy had been proven both absolute and meaningless, inevitable and interpretable, written in stone and subject to revision. Kratos' survival of his prophesied death revealed the fundamental flaw in Norse understanding of fate. The mural in Jotunheim had shown truth, but truth from one perspective, one possibility, one interpretation of symbols that could mean multiple things. The figure dying in Atreus' arms could have been Kratos, but it could also have been the death of the old Kratos, the ghost of Sparta finally laid to rest, so the father could fully emerge. The golden essence flowing from the dying figure wasn't life leaving, but transformation occurring, not ending but evolution. The revelation of Faye's complete plan came through discoveries that emerged like seeds planted in time. She had not just orchestrated the meeting with Kratos, but had chosen him specifically because he had broken fate before. She needed someone who had defied prophecy to father the child, who would redefine prophecy. Every lesson she had taught Atreus, every story she had told, every small magic she had shown him, had been calculated to activate at exactly the right moment. Even her death had been timed to coincide with Baldur's readiness to seek her, creating the cascade of events that would lead to Odin's downfall. Her foresight extended beyond her own mythology. The yellow handprint she had painted wasn't just protection, but a beacon, visible across pantheons to those who knew how to look. She had been in communication with survivors from other mythologies, gods and giants who had escaped their own apocalypses, building a network of resistance against the cycles of divine tyranny that seemed to plague all pantheons. Her son would not just be Loki of the Norse, but a bridge between mythologies, a living proof that prophecies could be survived, subverted, and surpassed. The cycle of vengeance that had defined divine existence for millennia had finally been broken, but the breaking required understanding what had created it. Every pantheon followed the same pattern of rise, corruption, and violent fall, because gods, by their nature, accumulated power without wisdom, strength without restraint, authority without accountability. The Greek pantheon had fallen to Kratos' rage. The Norse pantheon had fallen to Odin's fear. Other pantheons were falling or had fallen to their own fundamental flaws. Each apocalypse, unique in detail, but identical in structure. Yet Kratos had proven something unprecedented. A god could change, not just superficially but fundamentally, not just in action but in nature. He had been rage incarnate and became control embodied. He had been destruction personified and became protection realized. His transformation wasn't instant or easy or complete. He still carried the ashes of his first family, still felt the pull of violence, still struggled with the monster he had been. But struggle itself was the proof of change, the evidence that divine nature wasn't fixed but fluid. The seeds of hope in Ragnarok's destruction were numerous, but needed cultivation to grow. The end of divine tyranny had created space for something new, but that space could be filled by new tyranny as easily as by freedom. The power vacuum left by the Aesir's fall attracted ambitious beings from across the realms, each believing they could succeed where Odin had failed, each convinced they would be different, better, wiser. The temptation to simply replace one divine hierarchy with another was strong, familiar, and ultimately easier than creating something genuinely new. Tyr's emergence from his long imprisonment brought a different perspective on justice and war. He had traveled to other pantheons, not as conqueror, but as student, learning how different mythologies had handled the balance between order and freedom, between strength and wisdom, between divine power and mortal dignity. His proposal wasn't to rebuild what had been destroyed, but to create something unprecedented, a council where no single voice could dominate, where decisions required consensus rather than command, where power was temporary and conditional rather than absolute and eternal. The real Tyr's philosophy had been shaped by witnessing the fall of multiple pantheons. He had walked through the ruins of Olympus after Kratos' rampage, had seen Egyptian gods fade as their worshippers forgot them, had watched Celtic deities transform into folklore as belief became story. Each fall had taught him something about the impermanence of divine power and the permanence of consequences. His vision for the Nine Realms' future wasn't based on preventing another apocalypse, but on accepting that apocalypses were natural endings that could become natural beginnings if approached with wisdom rather than fear. The question of fate versus free will had been answered not with clarity, but with complexity. The Norns, when finally consulted directly, revealed that they had never controlled fate, but merely read it, seeing patterns that beings created through their choices and calling those patterns destiny. Free will and fate were not opposites, but partners, each creating the other in an endless dance of cause and effect. Every choice created fate for others, while every fate created choices for those experiencing it. The tapestry of existence wasn't woven by external forces, but by every being simultaneously, each thread affecting all others in ways too complex for even divine minds to fully grasp. The discovery that other pantheons were watching the Norse aftermath with intense interest added urgency to the rebuilding. The fall of two major pantheons in relatively quick succession had sent ripples through all mythologies. Some saw opportunity in the chaos, preparing invasions of the weakened Nine Realms. Others saw warning in the pattern, recognizing their own potential doom in Odin's paranoid spiral. Still others saw hope in Kratos' transformation, evidence that the cycles that had seemed eternal could be broken, that gods could evolve beyond their original natures. The Egyptian pantheon sent emissaries, their gods curious about this foreign deity who had survived two apocalypses. The Celtic gods, struggling with their own fade into obscurity, sought advice on preventing their complete dissolution. From the east came whispers of pantheons, so different from Western mythologies that their very existence challenged assumptions about divinity itself. The isolated Nine Realms were suddenly part of a much larger conversation about the future of divine existence in a universe that seemed to be outgrowing its need for gods. Atreus' departure to find the remaining giants carried implications beyond just reuniting a scattered people. Giants existed in every mythology under different names: Titans, Jotnar, Nephilim, Asuras, each representing primordial forces that predated the gods who had conquered them. If Atreus could unite these survivors across pantheons, he would be creating not just a restored race, but a new form of divine existence, one based on preservation rather than domination, on wisdom rather than power, on connection rather than isolation. The transformation of Valhalla into a space for redemption rather than repetition offered a model for how divine structures could evolve rather than simply end. The Einherjar who chose to remain were no longer trapped in endless battle, but engaged in endless growth, confronting not external enemies, but internal demons. The hall became a place where warriors could become scholars, where killers could become healers, where those who had lived by the sword could learn to live by something else. It was therapy on a divine scale, healing that acknowledged harm without excusing it. Kratos' shrine in Midgard, showing him as a god of hope rather than war, represented a fundamental shift in how divinity could be conceived. He had not demanded worship, but had earned respect. He had not promised salvation, but had demonstrated that beings could save themselves. He had not claimed perfection, but had shown that imperfection was not weakness but opportunity for growth. The prayers offered to him were not pleas for intervention, but commitments to self-improvement, not requests for divine action, but promises of mortal effort. The world tree's slow healing revealed that existence itself had been traumatized by the violence done within it. Yggdrasil's roots, which touched all realms, had carried the poison of divine cruelty throughout creation. Its recovery required not just time, but active care, conscious effort to repair damage that went beyond the physical into the conceptual. The tree was learning to exist without the Aesir, who had claimed to protect it while exploiting it, discovering that it could thrive without divine maintenance, that its natural state was healthier than its managed one. The implications of Ragnarok extended beyond the Norse cosmology into questions about the nature of existence itself. If gods could die, if pantheons could fall, if prophecies could be subverted, then what was actually eternal? The answer that emerged from the ruins was both simple and profound: that change was the only constant, that ending was just another form of beginning, that destruction and creation were not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance that neither gods nor mortals could stop, but both could learn to navigate. The seeds of future conflicts were already visible to those who looked carefully. Thrud's generation of young gods, shaped by witnessing their elders' failures, would eventually clash with the old ways that survivors like Sif represented. The power vacuum in various realms would attract not just ambitious gods, but entities from between pantheons, beings that existed in the spaces mythology hadn't mapped. The knowledge that pantheons could fall would inspire both revolution and paranoid crackdowns across all mythologies, potentially triggering the very apocalypses gods sought to prevent. The eternal question of whether gods could truly change their nature had been answered by Kratos, but that answer raised new questions. If one god could transform from destroyer to protector, what did that mean for divine identity itself? Were gods defined by their nature or their choices? Could Thor have chosen differently if he had lived? Could Odin have been redeemed if he had recognized his paranoia as sickness rather than wisdom? These questions haunted the survivors, especially those who had participated in the old regime's cruelties while telling themselves they had no choice. The lesson of Ragnarok was not that prophecy was false, but that it was incomplete. Not that fate didn't exist, but that it existed alongside free will in a paradox that defined existence itself. Every being was simultaneously free and fated, choosing their path while walking roads that had been laid out before their birth. The contradiction wasn't a flaw in understanding, but a fundamental truth about reality that required accepting paradox rather than resolving it. The Norse had fallen because they tried to control fate. The Greeks had fallen because they tried to deny it. Perhaps wisdom lay in dancing with fate rather than fighting or following it. Atreus' search for the remaining giants began with a single marble that Angrboda had given him, one that pulsed with warmth when pointed in certain directions like a compass made of condensed life. His journey would take him beyond the 9 realms, into mythologies where the word giant meant different things, where the survivors of primordial races had learned to hide so thoroughly that they had forgotten they were hiding. Each discovery would reveal that Odin's genocide had been just one note in a symphony of extinction that played across all pantheons, each god-king eliminating their predecessors to secure their rule. The mask fragments, though the complete mask had been destroyed, maintained their individual power, scattered across existence like seeds of dangerous knowledge. Some had fallen into the spaces between realms, those undefined areas where physics became philosophy and thought became substance. Others had been claimed by entities that existed outside traditional mythology, beings that fed on information itself, growing stronger with each truth they consumed. The fragments' continued existence meant that someone, someday, might gather them again, might ask the same questions Odin had asked, might receive the same maddening answer that existence had no inherent meaning beyond what conscious beings created. Tyr's revelation about his travels brought disturbing news from other pantheons. The Egyptian gods were experiencing their own twilight, not through violence but through gradual forgetting, their power fading as their stories became mythology rather than religion. The Japanese kami were retreating deeper into their hidden realms, sensing something approaching that even their ancient wisdom couldn't fully identify. The Hindu devas and asuras continued their eternal conflict, but both sides had noticed reality itself becoming less stable, as if the fundamental constants that maintained existence were becoming variables. The empty throne of Asgard had begun attracting something unexpected, not ambitious gods seeking power, but the throne itself developing consciousness. Without a ruler to define it, the seat of power was becoming power itself, accumulating the residual authority of every decision made from it, every command given, every judgment rendered. It was becoming a god without body, a will without form, a ruler without subject, and its first act of self-awareness was to question why it should exist at all. Valhalla's transformation continued in ways no one had predicted. The eternal warriors were not just finding redemption, but transcending their warrior nature entirely. Some were becoming artists, creating works that captured the beauty and violence's aftermath. Others became philosophers, developing new schools of thought about the nature of violence, honor, and death. The hall itself was evolving, its architecture reshaping to accommodate purposes beyond battle. growing libraries where there had been armories, gardens where there had been training grounds, meditation spaces where there had been slaughter yards. The discovery that Jormungandr remembered the future because he had been sent back from it raised questions about time itself. If the world serpent existed as a closed loop, always destined to fight Thor at Ragnarok and be sent back to wait for that same fight, then were there other such loops, other beings cycling through time, reliving variations of the same events, each iteration slightly different, but fundamentally unchanged? The implications suggested that Ragnarok wasn't an ending but a reset, that the 9 realms might be caught in a spiral of eternal recurrence, with only minor variations each cycle. Kratos' mural in Midgard had begun changing on its own, adding details that no artist had painted. New scenes appeared overnight, showing possible futures, potential paths, choices not yet made, but somehow already recorded. The mural showed Kratos teaching rather than fighting, building rather than destroying, creating rather than ending, but it also showed darker possibilities, returns to violence triggered by threats not yet manifest, choices that would transform the god of hope back into the ghost of Sparta. The mural had become prophetic, but prophecy of a different kind, showing not what must be but what could be. The Norns, freed from their role as readers of fate, by fate itself becoming unreadable, had vanished from their well. Some said they had dissolved into pure possibility, becoming the potential for destiny rather than destiny itself. Others claimed they had simply retired, exhausted by millennia of reading a story that always ended the same way. Their absence left a void in cosmic understanding, as beings across all realms realized they could no longer check their fate, could no longer know if their choices aligned with destiny or defied it. Young Thrud's experiments with Mjolnir revealed that the hammer was changing, evolving beyond its original purpose. Where once it had been purely a weapon of destruction, it was developing the ability to create, to build, to restore. She could use it to raise structures as easily as destroy them, to heal certain wounds as effectively as cause them. The hammer was learning from its new wielder, adapting to her desire to be different from her father and grandfather, becoming a tool for whatever its bearer truly needed rather than what they had been told they wanted. Angrboda's role as keeper of giant souls had expanded beyond simple preservation. She was learning to read the memories contained within each marble, accessing the complete history of the giants, their magic, their prophecies, their knowledge of cosmos-spanning truths that Odin had tried to eliminate. Each soul was a library, each marble a civilization's worth of wisdom compressed into crystallized consciousness. She was becoming not just a keeper, but an interpreter, learning to translate primordial truth into understanding that post-Ragnarok minds could grasp. The real Tyr's establishment of a Pantheon council was meeting resistance from unexpected sources, not from power-hungry gods, but from mortals who had grown comfortable with divine absence, who had learned to solve their own problems and feared the return of divine interference, however well-intentioned. The very beings gods claimed to protect were questioning whether they needed protection, whether divine wisdom was actually wise, whether immortal perspectives could understand mortal needs. The council faced the paradox of trying to help those who no longer wanted help. Sindri's disappearance had left ripples beyond just his absence. His forge, abandoned but still somehow functioning, had begun creating things on its own. Weapons no one had commissioned appeared on its anvil. Tools for purposes that didn't yet exist materialized in its corners. The forge was creating for a future only it could see, preparing for conflicts and challenges that hadn't yet manifested. Some theorized that Sindri hadn't disappeared, but had merged with his forge, becoming the act of creation itself rather than a creator. The Green Rift, that tier between realms that Odin's experiments had created, was growing despite the All-Father's death. It was becoming a wound in reality that leaked not just energy, but possibility. allowing things that could exist to briefly become things that did exist. Creatures of pure mathematics emerged, existed for moments or centuries, then dissolved back into theory. The rift was becoming a doorway to the impossible, and the impossible was beginning to notice the possible looking in. Freya's work to rebuild the Vanir way was revealing magic that had been suppressed for so long it had been forgotten. Cedar, properly practiced without Odin's corruptions, could do more than see and influence fate. It could heal wounds in reality itself, could communicate across not just space but time, could transform not just matter but meaning. She was teaching a new generation of practitioners, not all of them Vanir, not all of them gods, creating a democratic magic that anyone with wisdom and will could learn. The prophecy of Loki's return had taken on new meaning with Atreus's departure. It wasn't predicting his physical return, but the return of what Loki represented: change, transformation, the breaking of stagnant patterns. Every realm was experiencing its own version of Loki's influence, established orders being questioned, ancient traditions being challenged, fundamental assumptions being overturned. Loki had become less a person and more a principle, the force of necessary change that prevented any system from becoming too rigid to adapt. Other pantheons' champions were beginning to arrive in the 9 realms, not as invaders, but as refugees, pilgrims, and students. They came seeking understanding of how 2 pantheons had fallen and what had risen from their ashes. A young Egyptian god, whose name translated to tomorrow's dawn, came seeking Kratos, wanting to learn how to prevent their pantheon's slow fade. A Celtic warrior poet, whose songs could reshape reality, sought the remnants of giant prophecy, believing they contained verses to a cosmic song that all mythologies were unconsciously singing. The eternal question of whether gods could truly change had been answered, but had spawned new questions. If gods could change, could they change enough? Could they evolve fast enough to remain relevant in a cosmos that was outgrowing its need for divine intervention? Could they transform from rulers to partners, from parents to equals, from answers to fellow questioners? The future of divinity itself hung on these questions, and the answers would determine whether the age of gods would end or transform into something unprecedented. The final mystery was the simplest and most profound. In all the prophecies, all the predictions, all the foretellings of doom and destiny, no one had prophesied hope, yet hope had emerged from Ragnarok's ashes, not as divine gift, but as mortal choice, not as prophecy, but as possibility. The future was unwritten, not because the Norns had abandoned their posts, but because every being now held the pen, each choice adding words to a story that had no predetermined ending. The age of prophecy had ended. The age of possibility had begun. And somewhere in the space between mythologies, Atreus walked paths that had never been walked, seeking giants who might not want to be found, carrying questions that might not have answers, becoming something that had never existed before. A god without pantheon, a giant without homeland, a bridge between what was and what might be. His footsteps wrote new prophecies with each stride, but these were prophecies of a different kind, not predictions of what must be, but invitations to what could become.